History loves its kings. Some ruled with wisdom, others with swords, and a few with nothing but delusion and a very shiny hat. These were the men who built empires, broke laws, rewrote religions, and on occasion married so many times their family tree looked like a tangled bush on fire. But being famous doesn't always mean being smart. Some were geniuses of statecraft. Others couldn't spell king without assistance from 6 scribes and a divine miracle. From the boy king buried in gold, to the short guy who tried to conquer Europe with sheer overconfidence, we're diving deep into history's royal VIP list. The kings whose names echo through the ages, usually followed by the phrase, "Wait, he did what?" Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. In the grand pantheon of ancient Egyptian rulers, most pharaohs are remembered for what they did. Tutankhamun, on the other hand, is remembered for being found. That's right. If fame were measured by lifetime achievements, Tutankhamun wouldn't even make the list. But if fame means trending for 3,000 years straight, thanks to a shiny tomb and a cursed press campaign, then congratulations, Tutankhamun. Your royal clout is undefeated. Born around 1341 BCE, Tutankhamun ascended to the throne at the tender age of 9, which, to be honest, sounds like a great idea if you're in the market for state policies based entirely on no bedtime and mandatory chocolate for breakfast. Ancient Egypt basically handed the keys to the kingdom to a child who probably still thought the Nile was where the bathwater came from. But Egypt wasn't exactly chill at the time. His father, likely the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, had turned the kingdom upside down by telling everyone to stop worshipping Egypt's usual crowd of gods, and instead focus on just one, the sun disk Aten. It was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of telling everyone their beloved pantheon was being cancelled and replaced with a minimalist, one-god subscription plan. Spoiler, the people hated it, so when little Tutankhamun, his original name, became pharaoh, his handlers, mostly priests and advisors, who were very tired of Aten's exclusive spotlight, steered him back to the old ways. Tutankhamun got a rebrand and became Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, aka the old beloved god, making a royal comeback. Imagine a modern political pivot, only with more incense and significantly more cats. Now it's tempting to imagine Tutan ruling with the confidence of a boy pharaoh prodigy. In reality, he was more like a royal mascot. Behind the scenes, powerful figures like the Vizier Ai and the General Horemheb were probably pulling all the strings while Tutankhamun nodded politely and asked where the snacks were. Tutan's reign lasted about 9 years, just long enough for him to help Egypt course-correct its religious detour, and also long enough to suffer from a truly unfortunate laundry list of health problems. Thanks to modern science and a few CT scans that were definitely not on his consent form, we now know Tut had a clubfoot, scoliosis, malaria, and a fractured leg that probably did him in. Yes, this child king had the body of a 90-year-old man, and the luck of a clay pot in a boulder factory. But let's be honest, none of that made him a legend. What made King Tut a household name thousands of years later was what happened in 1922, when British archaeologist Howard Carter stumbled upon the only largely intact pharaonic tomb ever discovered in the Valley of the Kings. While other royal tombs had been picked clean centuries ago, Tutankhamun's had somehow stayed sealed, a dusty time capsule of unimaginable wealth and glittery excess. And when Carter poked his head in and was asked, "Do you see anything?" he famously replied, "Yes, wonderful things." Translation: solid gold, everywhere, literal treasure chests, bejeweled sandals, and a golden death mask that looked like the ancient Egyptian version of a Snapchat filter for divinity. The world lost its collective mind. King Tut became an instant, global celebrity. Museums scrambled to host exhibitions. Newspapers ran stories about the curse of the pharaoh, after several members of the excavation team mysteriously died, or mildly stubbed their toes and were dramatically British about it. Hollywood got involved. Mummies were suddenly hot commodities, and King Tut became the glittering face of ancient Egypt's long-dead glamour. Here's the kicker: the guy had done almost nothing. No great wars, no world-changing edicts, no monuments rivaling the pyramids. Just a short, sickly life, a gloriously untouched tomb, and one very flattering funerary mask. In a way, Tutankhamun was the original influencer. Not much going on behind the scenes, but an aesthetic so powerful it defined a generation. And if you've ever seen a child's Halloween costume, a cereal box, or a Las Vegas casino with vaguely Egyptian branding, you've seen the ripple effects of Tut's unintentional brand. Historians may argue about how much of his fame is deserved, but here's a fact. Tutankhamun managed to outshine rulers who built empires, reigned for decades, and shaped civilizations by simply staying dead long enough to go viral. Not bad for a teenager with a limp and a gold mask. Let's set the stage. You're born in 356 BCE as the Crown Prince of Macedonia. Your dad is Philip II, a one-eyed war machine who united all of Greece under his control through sheer military brilliance and probably just the right amount of yelling. Your mum is Olympias, a priestess who claims you're literally the son of Zeus. That's right. Your bedtime stories aren't fairy tales, they're your origin myth. Now toss in Aristotle as your personal tutor. Yes, that Aristotle, the guy who basically invented logic, science, and being right all the time. Alexander got philosophy, literature, biology, and probably a very early form of imposter syndrome. Because how do you follow that? Answer: you conquer everything. At just 20 years old, Alexander became king after his father was very suspiciously assassinated. No one pointed fingers, but let's just say Olympias was conveniently nearby and not smiling. From that moment on, Alexander became less of a person and more of an unstoppable ambition engine on horseback. He didn't waste time. First, he crushed rebellions in Greece, just to remind everyone who was boss. Then he turned his sights on the Persian Empire, because why not start by taking on the largest empire in the known world? His army, though smaller, was fast, organized, and incredibly loyal. Think of it as the ancient world's version of a startup taking on a sluggish corporate giant. And like all overachieving startups, Alexander's campaign moved fast and broke everything. At the Battle of Issus, he sliced through Persian forces like a historical buzzsaw. Then at Gargamella, he faced Emperor Darius III, who brought elephants, scythe chariots, and the kind of confidence you usually only get from being grossly unprepared. Alexander responded by shattering Darius's army and his self-esteem in one of the most decisive victories in ancient history. By the age of 25, Alexander had control over Egypt, Persia, and a resume that made Julius Caesar cry in Latin centuries later. In Egypt, they made him pharaoh. In Persia, he declared himself king of kings. In India, he fought war elephants and stared at them like, yeah, I've got a plan for that. But while his conquests were impressive, Alexander's real legacy was turning the world into his personal cultural blender. Wherever he went, he didn't just conquer, he Hellenized. That meant spreading Greek language, architecture, religion, and art like it was the latest TikTok trend. Cities named Alexandria popped up like ancient Starbucks, each one boasting theaters, gymnasiums, and enough columns to make modern architects weep. Still, this empire was held together with sheer willpower and excellent hair. Alexander ruled like a god on earth, but ruled alone. No successor, no plan, just vibes and victory. Then came the burnout. By the time he reached India, his army, who had followed him for years across deserts, mountains, and more battles than they could count, finally said, "No thanks. We'd like to go home before our sandals dissolve." Alexander sulked, pouted, and finally relented. But his return home involved a scenic death march through the Gedrosian desert, where half his army died of thirst. Not exactly the Mediterranean cruise they'd envisioned. Then, in 323 BCE, at the grand old age of 32, Alexander fell ill in Babylon. He died after days of fever and delirium. Some say it was poison. Others suggest malaria or typhoid, and a few dramatic theories claim his body didn't start decomposing for days because he was too divine for rot. Or, more likely, the embalmers were just very, very slow. But here's where it gets truly chaotic. He left no clear heir. When asked who should succeed him, he allegedly muttered, "To the strongest," which is a cool thing to say if you're starting a battle royale, but not great for peaceful succession. What followed was 50 years of infighting known as the Wars of the Diadochi. a royal free-for-all that made Game of Thrones look like a polite disagreement over brunch. His empire shattered like a wine cup at a Macedonian wedding. Generals grabbed what they could. Ptolemy took Egypt and founded a dynasty that ended with Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra. While others battled over chunks of Persia and Asia, the dream of a unified empire, gone. But the chaos? Oh, that part stuck around. Still, Alexander's impact didn't vanish with his death. His fusion of East and West laid foundations for centuries of culture, trade, and scientific exchange. He inspired leaders, tyrants, artists, and at least a dozen wildly inaccurate Hollywood movies. In fact, the only thing more global than his empire was his ego. Alexander the Great didn't just carve out a piece of the world, he carved his name into it. And though his empire crumbled, his legend didn't. He remains the gold standard of overachievement and the blueprint for ambition. Imagine being so obsessed with control that even after your death, you want to micromanage the underworld. That was Qin Shi Huang, the man who turned ancient China into a single empire, outlawed criticism, paved roads and banned books, because if you can't win an argument, just make it illegal to have one. Let's rewind to 259 BCE. Born as Ying Zheng, he was the son of the king of Qin, one of the warring states of ancient China. And when we say warring states, we mean a centuries-long free-for-all of kingdoms clawing at each other, like toddlers fighting over a toy dragon. At just 13, Ying Zheng became king after his father's death. But don't picture some fragile boy ruler nervously taking the throne. No, Ying Zheng was more like a teenage CEO with a hostile takeover plan, and absolutely no chill. By the age of 38, he had conquered all rival states through diplomacy, clever alliances, brutal warfare, and the occasional accidental assassination. Once everyone was either conquered or extremely dead, he declared himself Qin Shi Huangdi, meaning first emperor of Qin, not king emperor, because apparently most supreme guy who won everything didn't fit on official seals. Now, to his credit, the guy got stuff done. He standardized currency, weights and writing systems across China. No more confusing regional measurements like 3 goats equals 1 shovel. He also built an early version of the Great Wall to keep out nomadic raiders from the north. Though it's worth noting, he mostly connected older regional walls and forced millions of people to build them. If you were a peasant, great was probably not the adjective you used. He even created an extensive network of roads so imperial troops and tax collectors could reach you faster. Yay, efficiency. So yes, Qin Shi Huang unified China not just politically, but bureaucratically. He was like the world's first overzealous regional manager, only with armies and a habit of exiling scholars. Speaking of scholars, let's talk about his war on books. Qin Shi Huang didn't like being second-guessed, so when scholars started debating his policies by quoting ancient texts, he said, "You know what, let's just not." Then he ordered thousands of books burned, and according to some records, buried several hundred scholars alive. Take that, Goodreads. In his mind, history only needed one version. His. All other knowledge was obsolete, dangerous, or too wordy. Imagine being so allergic to criticism that your ideal library is just a long scroll that reads, "I'm right, everyone else is deleted." But even more than he hated books, he feared death. Deeply, unreasonably, passionately. This man did not want to die, ever. And this is where things get weird. Qin Shi Huang launched an entire national science project to make himself immortal. He sent ships of alchemists to search for magical islands with elixirs of life. Spoiler, they found nothing, or they did, and just never came back, deciding that unpaid immortality internships weren't worth it. Meanwhile, back at home, his court alchemists claimed they could brew the secret to eternal life, so they handed him pills made of mercury. You know, the stuff that makes thermometers tick, and humans stop ticking, and the emperor drank them, repeatedly. He also made plans for the afterlife, like it was the ultimate VIP lounge. The centerpiece? The terracotta army. Over 8,000 life-sized clay soldiers buried with him, each with unique faces, weapons and armor. There were horses, chariots, musicians and even acrobats. Basically, an entire clay Cirque du Soleil, ready to serve him beyond the grave. And his tomb, oh, we haven't even opened it yet. According to ancient accounts, it's protected by rivers of mercury and booby traps. Modern scientists haven't fully excavated it, partly because of safety concerns, and partly because, let's be honest, no one wants to be the guy who accidentally triggers the world's deadliest mercury sprinkler system. Despite all the planning, paranoia, and liquid metal consumption, Qin Shi Huang died at the age of 49 while traveling through eastern China. His officials, terrified of political chaos, tried to hide his death for weeks. They literally dragged his rotting corpse around in a carriage filled with fish to mask the smell. That's not a joke. That's history's worst road trip. After his death, the Qin dynasty crumbled within just a few years. Turns out, ruling through fear, forced labor, and censorship doesn't build much loyalty. The empire he so meticulously assembled was gobbled up by civil war, and China entered another messy period of division. But Qin Shi Huang's legacy stuck. He was ruthless, brilliant, terrifying, and oddly relatable in his neurotic fear of dying. While other kings left behind monuments, laws, or poetry, Qin left behind an empire, an army made of clay, and a warning label on mercury. So yes, he unified China, reshaped history, and went out the same way he lived, dramatic, ambitious, and absolutely unwilling to read a book that might disagree with him. Let's be honest, early medieval Europe was an absolute mess. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the continent descended into a centuries-long group project with no leader, no plan, and everyone hoarding land like it was toilet paper in a pandemic. Enter Charlemagne, a man so massive in size, ambition, and beard length that people later called him the father of Europe. And to be fair, Europe did need a father figure, preferably one who could hold a sword and tell people to stop fighting for 5 minutes. Born in 747, Charlemagne, aka Charles the Great, inherited half of the Frankish kingdom from his father, Pepin the Short. Yes, that was his real name, Pepin the Short. Honestly, you'd overcompensate by conquering Europe too, if your dad was named after a medieval garden gnome. Soon after, Charlemagne took over the rest of the kingdom, when his brother Carloman died under very convenient circumstances. Let's just say no one looked too hard into it, because Charlemagne was already sharpening his sword and eyeing a map. Once in full control, he did not sit still. Charlemagne launched campaign after campaign against the Lombards in Italy, the Saxons in northern Germany, the Avars in Central Europe, and pretty much anyone who looked at him funny. He expanded his empire across modern-day France, Germany, the Low Countries, Switzerland, Austria, and northern Italy. This guy turned wanderlust into conquest lust. But unlike many kings who just wanted more land to tax, Charlemagne had ideas. He believed in a grand Christian empire, unified not just by borders, but by belief. He forced conquered peoples to convert to Christianity, which sounds nice until you realize it was usually under the slogan, "Get baptized or get beheaded." His missionary approach was less Sunday school and more sword-point sermon. Still, his religious fervor impressed the right people, particularly the Pope. In 800 CE, while Charlemagne was attending Mass in Rome, Pope Leo III pulled a little surprise party. Except instead of balloons, there was a crown. The Pope slapped it on Charlemagne's head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. Surprise, you're now the most powerful man in Western Europe. Also, congrats on accidentally rebooting the Roman Empire. Charlemagne reportedly wasn't thrilled about the surprise coronation. Some say he would have refused it had he known in advance. After all, it implied that the Pope had the power to make emperors. That small act would echo through centuries of church-vast state drama, like an early pilot for a very messy reality show called Clerics and Crowns. But political tensions aside, Charlemagne took his new title seriously. He didn't just want to rule a big Christian empire, he wanted it to function. At the time, most of his nobles were basically illiterate warlords in fancy hats. The clergy weren't much better. Even monks copied texts with spelling errors so bad that future scholars thought Latin had suffered a head injury. So Charlemagne launched the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning across his empire. He invited scholars from Ireland, Italy, and beyond to his court in Aachen, where they were tasked with educating the clergy, copying classical texts, and teaching the alphabet like it was the hottest new invention. He established cathedral schools and monastic centers, insisting that anyone involved in church leadership had to know how to read, write, and not mistake a goat for a vowel. This from a man who by all accounts couldn't read himself. He tried, he really did, but literacy never quite stuck. Charlemagne allegedly kept wax tablets under his pillow so he could practice writing at night. That's right, while you're scrolling memes at 2 a.m. Charlemagne was stress writing the alphabet in bed. But leadership isn't always about personal skills. It's about setting the tone, and Charlemagne set the tone for an empire that finally began to value literacy, administration, and rule of law. He introduced standardized coinage, legal reforms, and even sent inspectors called missi dominici around the empire to make sure his officials weren't turning their local regions into corrupt medieval frat houses. At home, Charlemagne lived relatively simply. Sure, he had a palace, but he dressed plainly, preferred roast meat over fancy banquets, and banned drunkenness at his court. He had a ton of children, somewhere between 18 and enough to start a minor war, but refused to let any of his daughters marry. Why? Because he didn't trust their suitors. Classic dad move. When Charlemagne died in 814, after 4 decades of expansion and reform, the empire went to his son Louis the Pious, and like any good sequel, the story got slower, weirder, and less stable. The Carolingian Empire eventually splintered under his descendants, but the legacy remained. Charlemagne's empire laid the foundations for modern France and Germany. His coronation set the precedent for the Holy Roman Empire, which lasted in name, anyway, until 1806. He bridged the ancient and medieval worlds. He made education cool again, and he did it all while struggling to sound out the word cat. So if you've ever said, "I can't do this, I'm not smart enough," just remember Charlemagne couldn't read. But he still built Europe, long before Tinder, Ancestry.com, or modern military doctrine. There was Genghis Khan, a man who united a bunch of squabbling nomadic tribes into a supercharged war machine that tore across continents like a historical hurricane. He had no patience for borders, no respect for emperors, and absolutely no chill when it came to empire building. Let's start with his origin story, which reads like a revenge-fueled survival drama, with bonus horse chases. Born as Temujin around 1162 in the Mongolian steppe, he came from a modest background, no throne, no kingdom, and barely enough goats to be considered middle class. After his father was poisoned by rival tribes, Temujin's family was left destitute, abandoned by allies, and forced to eat wild roots and rodents just to survive. Instead of growing up bitter and starting a podcast about it, Temujin got even in a much more medieval way by uniting every Mongol tribe under his banner, whether they liked it or not. By 1206, he had crushed his enemies, made frenemies useful, and been declared Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. Spoiler, the universal part wasn't just local branding. The man had ambitions that made most rulers look like regional managers of small-town souvenir shops. And how did he build his empire? Not through flashy crowns or royal decrees, but with raw, brilliant military genius. Genghis understood mobility, flexibility, and psychological warfare better than anyone before him. His army was like an ancient SWAT team on horseback, disciplined, lightning fast, and utterly ruthless. Mongol horsemen could ride for days, sleep in their saddles, and fire arrows accurately, while galloping at full speed. Meanwhile, European knights were still figuring out how not to tip over in their armor. Genghis ran military campaigns, like tech startups run beta tests. Fail fast, learn fast, scale aggressively. If a tactic didn't work, he adapted. If a city resisted, he made an example out of it. If a ruler surrendered early, he often spared them. But if you made him ride all the way to your gates and then said no, congratulations, your city is now a cautionary tale written in ash. And yet, for all his ruthlessness, Genghis Khan wasn't the barbaric caricature often painted in old Western histories. He was a surprising champion of meritocracy, religious tolerance, and free trade, provided you didn't try to assassinate his envoys, which one foolish sultan did, prompting a Mongol response so catastrophic. It basically erased the Khwarezmian Empire off the map. Within his expanding territory, Genghis welcomed all religions, Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, shamans, as long as they didn't try to run the government. He even granted tax exemptions to religious leaders and established communication routes that were the medieval version of high-speed internet. The Yam system, an early pony express, allowed for rapid message delivery across thousands of miles. You could send a message from China to Eastern Europe in the time it took most European kings to figure out where their borders were. Oh, and trade. Genghis made the Silk Road safer than it had been in centuries. Merchants flocked to Mongol territory, relieved that their caravans were more likely to be protected than robbed. It was globalization before the buzzword, and with more camels. But let's talk about that. Ahim, genetic legacy. Modern genetic studies estimate that about 1 in every 200 men alive today carries a Y chromosome traceable to Genghis Khan. That's not a typo. 1 in 200. Across continents. The man didn't just conquer nations, he personally conquered the concept of lineage. This was no accident. Genghis took numerous wives and consorts from every region he conquered. His sons and grandsons continued the tradition with gusto. You weren't truly a Mongol royal until your family reunion needed a continent-wide seating chart. Despite all this, Genghis Khan never built a permanent palace. No marble thrones. No luxury temples. He ruled from tents, campfires and saddles. His legacy was in movement, momentum, and mayhem. When he died in 1227, cause still uncertain, possibly from falling off a horse or being wounded in battle, his body was buried in an unmarked grave. To keep it secret, the funeral procession allegedly killed every witness they passed. And then the soldiers who did that were also killed, just to be extra sure. After his death, his descendants continued his empire's expansion. His grandson Kublai Khan would go on to rule China and host Marco Polo, while other branches reached as far west as Poland and Hungary. But it was Genghis who set the gears in motion. His name still carries a mythical weight, part destroyer, part innovator, part fertility, god. To some, he was a monster, to others, a unifier. But regardless of perspective, Genghis Khan redefined what an empire could be. He didn't just ride across history, he rewrote it. And whether you're aware of it or not, there's a tiny, statistically significant chance that your family tree might include a Mongol with serious commitment issues. If history were a fashion show, Louis XIV would strut down the runway in embroidered silk, a powdered wig taller than your dignity, and shoes so bedazzled they could blind a peasant at 20 paces. He wasn't just a king, he was a statement, and the statement was, I am the center of the universe, and also, please admire the ruffles. Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King, ruled France for an absurd 72 years, longer than most empires survive, and definitely long enough to make at least some mistakes. He took the throne in 1643, at the tender age of 5. Yes, 5, which is typically the age for finger painting, not foreign policy. But, don't worry, France made sure a regent, his mother and her advisor, Cardinal Mazarin, handled the real decisions, while Louis presumably focused on the important business of napping and royal tantrums. But when Mazarin died in 1661, Louis stepped up and decided that he alone would rule. No more advisors pulling strings. No more shared power. Just Louis, center stage, basking in the glow of his own authority. When asked how the government would function without a chief minister, he famously said, L'État, c'est moi. Translation, I am the state. A bold statement, and one that sounds less cool when your nation later collapses into bankruptcy and revolution. Now let's talk Versailles, Louis's crown jewel of fabulous excess. Originally just a humble hunting lodge, Louis transformed it into the most elaborate, dazzling, and functionally absurd palace in Europe. Why? Because nothing says absolute monarchy like 700 rooms, 2,000 windows, and a garden so big you need military training to navigate it. Versailles wasn't just real estate, it was strategy. Louis moved the French nobility in with him so he could keep an eye on them, distract them with parties, and slowly neuter their political power with a deadly combination of etiquette rules and non-stop opera. Imagine being a noble and realizing your career now hinges on how gracefully you hold a soup spoon in front of the king. Welcome to the world's most luxurious hostage situation. While Versailles sparkled, Louis himself became a living symbol of style. His daily wardrobe required an entourage of attendants to help him get dressed, because no one wears 17 layers of gold-threaded lace without assistance. He set fashion trends so aggressively that European courts scrambled to copy them. If Louis wore it, it was law. and if he wore it once, it was already outdated by lunch. But there was one accessory Louis never managed to balance properly: the national budget. See? Funding an ego the size of a solar system doesn't come cheap. Louis poured money into constant wars, from the War of Devolution to the War of Spanish Succession. These were not short skirmishes. They were long, bloody conflicts that drained France's treasury like a hole in a golden bucket. Why all the wars? Well, Louis liked expanding France's borders, proving his military prowess. And let's be real, showing off. War was another stage, and Louis was always in costume. But the results were mixed. Some campaigns earned territorial gains, others just earned France mountains of debt and entire villages full of very unimpressed taxpayers. To fund all this drama, Louis taxed everything that moved, and if it didn't move, he taxed it anyway. Peasants bore the brunt, as usual, while the nobility danced in marble halls and argued about whose powdered wig had the most feathers. By the end of his reign, France was stunning on the surface and teetering underneath. The country was overextended, underfunded, and so heavily taxed that peasant uprisings were more of a Tuesday hobby than a crisis. But inside Versailles, it was still high kicks and harpsichords, baby. To his credit, Louis wasn't all rhinestones and recklessness. He reformed the legal system, strengthened royal bureaucracy, and invested in arts and culture so fiercely that he basically invented the French cultural stereotype: ballet, theatre, architecture. He sponsored it all. Under his patronage, France became the center of high European culture. He didn't just wear the drama, he funded it. But the weight of a 72-year reign will catch up with you eventually. In his final years, Louis saw his empire weary from wars, his people impoverished, and his own family line decimated by plagues and tragedies. He outlived his son, grandson, and great-grandson, all while hanging on like a fabulously dressed vampire who refused to retire. When he finally died in 1715, at the age of 76, the country breathed a complicated sigh. His great-grandson Louis XV took the throne as a child, setting up yet another century of royal extravagance that would eventually end with heads rolling in the revolution. But that's someone else's mess. Louis XIV remains one of the most iconic monarchs in world history, a ruler whose power, flair, and fiscal irresponsibility became legendary. He gave us splendor, Versailles, a glorious ballet of control, and also the economic disaster that brewed beneath it all. He was the king who made France glow, and then forgot to pay the electricity bill. Henry VIII was the kind of man who didn't believe in subtlety, or moderation, or stable marriages. He came to power in 1509 as a charismatic, athletic, dashing king of England, basically the Renaissance's answer to a pop star with a jousting hobby. But by the time he left the stage in 1547, he had a bloated court, a bloated government, and a bloated everything else. Somewhere along the way, Henry became less of a king and more of a cautionary tale in royal overindulgence. Let's start with the headline: 6 wives. Not 6 girlfriends, not 6 royal crushes, 6 marriages, each with drama levels that would make reality TV producers weep with joy. His romantic timeline reads less like a love story and more like a medieval soap opera with swords. First up, Catherine of Aragon, his older brother's widow and a Spanish princess. They were married for over 20 years, which by Henry's standards is basically eternal. But when she failed to produce a surviving male heir, how dare she, Henry began to panic. Never mind that daughters can also rule. He wanted a son with a sword, not a daughter with a tiara. So he asked the Pope for a divorce. The Pope said no. Henry responded the way most emotionally unstable kings do. He broke up with the Catholic Church. Yes, he founded an entirely new church, the Church of England, just to swap wives. It was the most theologically complicated breakup in history, and it launched the English Reformation, changing the religious fabric of the country forever. All because one man wanted to swap queens like trading cards. Next came Anne Boleyn, witty, ambitious, and unfortunately equipped with a mind of her own. Henry adored her, until she also failed to give him a son. Accusations of adultery, some probably fabricated, incest, definitely fabricated, and witchcraft, because why not, led to her beheading in 1536. That's right, marriage, then murder. The Tudor version of Unfriended. Wife #3 was Jane Seymour, the only one to give him what he wanted, a male heir, the sickly Prince Edward. Tragically, Jane died from childbirth complications shortly after. Henry grieved her so deeply that he actually had her buried next to him for eternity. That's as close to a romantic gesture as Henry ever got. You gave me a son so you can be my forever corpse buddy. But mourning didn't stop him for long. Enter Anne of Cleves, a German princess he chose, based on a painted portrait that may have been generously flattering. When she arrived in person, Henry declared she looked like a Flanders mare. The marriage lasted 6 months. No one lost their head, but Anne got a hefty settlement and her own castle, basically the Tudor version of "Thanks for trying, here's a country house." Wife #5 was Catherine Howard, Anne Boleyn's cousin, and, as history proves, not a great career choice. She was 17, he was pushing 50, and weighing in at royal rhinoceros levels. When rumours of her infidelity spread, Henry didn't hesitate. She was executed too. Another head rolled, and the Tudor dating pool got even smaller. Finally, Catherine Parr, the nurse wife. She was clever, loyal, and most importantly, didn't challenge Henry's ego. She outlived him, which, by Tudor standards, qualifies as a resounding success. But Henry wasn't just busy dismantling marriages, he was also remodeling England itself. When he split from Rome, he seized control of the monasteries, looted their treasure, and shut them down in what's known as the dissolution of the monasteries. That money didn't just vanish, it funded wars, palaces, and Henry's increasingly luxurious lifestyle. If it had velvet, gold thread, or an absurd feathered hat attached to it, Henry probably owned 3. And let's talk about his lifestyle. In his youth, Henry was athletic, multilingual, and fond of music. He played the lute, wrote poetry, and hosted tournaments. But as he aged, so did his waistline and his temper. He ballooned to well over 300 pounds, developed leg ulcers that never healed, and required custom-built reinforced furniture just to sit without collapsing royal infrastructure. By the end of his life, he was carried around on a padded chair like an angry pudding with a crown. Meanwhile, England was constantly at war with France, with Scotland, with anyone who dared blink at Henry's borders. His military campaigns drained the treasury faster than his marriages drained court morale. He debased the currency to pay for it all, literally adding cheaper metals to the coins, which led to rampant inflation. Great for collectors, bad for peasants. Yet somehow, despite the chaos, Henry left behind a lasting legacy. He laid the groundwork for England's transformation into a Protestant power. His daughter, Elizabeth I, would go on to become one of the most revered monarchs in history. And thanks to his serial marriages, Shakespeare ended up with enough material to write 3 tragedies, a comedy, and maybe a musical. Henry VIII wasn't just a king, he was a tornado in tights, a walking paradox, devout yet violent, cultured yet crude, powerful yet endlessly insecure. He ruled not with wisdom, but with sheer willpower, brute force, and the unshakable belief that if something didn't work, be it a wife, a war, or a religion, he could simply start over. If you thought powerful rulers had to choose between brute force and brainy finesse, then allow us to introduce Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Sultan who could conquer cities, write romantic poetry, draft a legal code, commission a mosque, and still find time to wear a jewel-encrusted turban that doubled as a conversation starter. Suleiman wasn't just a king, he was a walking empire upgrade. Born in 1494, he inherited the Ottoman throne in 1520 and ruled for 46 years, overseeing the empire's golden age with all the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly how magnificent he was. By the time he took power, the Ottomans were already a rising force. But under Suleiman's rule, they didn't just rise, they soared. He expanded the empire's borders deep into Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. His military campaigns reached Hungary, Iraq, and even the gates of Vienna, causing European monarchs to collectively sweat through their ruffled collars. And this wasn't random, sword-swinging chaos. Suleiman's military was highly organized, led by elite troops like the Janissaries, infantry trained from childhood to serve the Sultan with terrifying efficiency and even better uniforms. When Suleiman marched, cities fell, borders redrew themselves, and maps had to be reprinted like awkward software patches. But Suleiman wasn't just expanding his territory, he was refining it. His nickname in the West may have been the Magnificent, but in the Islamic world, he's often called Kanuni, the lawgiver. That's because Suleiman reformed and codified the Ottoman legal system, mixing Islamic Sharia law with Sultanic law, Kanun into a system so well organized that modern bureaucrats would shed tears of joy reading it. Land taxes, inheritance laws, criminal codes, he streamlined them all, ensuring the empire didn't just function, but thrived. No more local governors, making up punishments like 3 camels and a slap. Suleiman turned chaos into order, turning the empire into a place where even minor officials had clear instructions on how not to mess things up. And yet, while building empires by day, Suleiman moonlighted as a poet under the pen name Muhibi, meaning the lover. That's right. This guy led armies and drafted tax codes by morning, and by evening was composing love verses with more passion than a telenovela. One of his most famous subjects of poetry, his favorite wife, Hurrem Sultan, better known in the West as Roxolana, a former concubine who rose through the ranks to become his legal wife. A rare honor in the Ottoman world, she wielded real influence at court, and their romance reads like a power couple drama with excellent upholstery. Hurrem wasn't just lounging around in palace gardens. She was corresponding with rulers, advising Suleiman, and orchestrating diplomatic alliances. Their partnership shook the traditional power structure and launched what historians now call the Sultanate of Women, where imperial wives and mothers began to wield more political clout than ever before. Basically, Suleiman made the empire stronger, and his wife made sure he didn't accidentally burn it down. When it came to architecture, Suleiman wasn't exactly modest. He hired Mimar Sinan, the Ottoman equivalent of Michelangelo, and tasked him with building some of the most stunning structures in the Islamic world. The result? A skyline full of domes and minarets that still stuns today, like the Suleymaniye Mosque, a building so beautiful it practically apologizes for the taxes that paid for it. While Europe was still recovering from its medieval hangover, Istanbul was bursting with libraries, fountains, hospitals and marketplaces. The Ottoman capital under Suleiman became a cultural and intellectual hub, where scholars debated science, artists painted in miniature, and poets waxed lyrical about tulips. Yes, tulips. The Ottomans loved them so much that centuries later, they triggered an actual economic bubble called tulip mania. But that's another tale. Despite his brilliance, Suleiman wasn't immune to tragedy. His heir apparent, Mustafa, was executed on suspicion of treason, possibly encouraged by palace rivals and fueled by a cocktail of paranoia and palace intrigue. Suleiman mourned deeply, but didn't undo the decision. When you're running an empire the size of 3 time zones, even your grief has to be scheduled. By the time he died in 1566, on campaign of course, because retirement wasn't in the Ottoman job description, he had reigned longer than any other sultan, and had fundamentally shaped the empire into a global powerhouse. His death was kept secret for weeks to avoid panic, and his body was quietly returned to Istanbul, buried beside the woman he wrote love poems to. In between demolishing entire kingdoms, Suleiman remains one of the most balanced rulers in history, a conqueror with a pen, a poet with a sword, a statesman with a flair for the fabulous. He didn't just build an empire, he made it sing, sparkle, and quote rhyming verse while doing it. So next time you think you're a good multitasker because you answered emails while microwaving lunch, just remember, Suleiman expanded half the known world before dinner, and still wrote love poetry by moonlight. If history had an award for most dramatic career arc, Napoleon Bonaparte would win it twice, just like his actual career, which included 2 downfalls, 2 exiles, and 1 very famous Waterloo. Born on the modest island of Corsica in 1769, Napoleon started life as a relatively unimportant kid with a chip on his shoulder, a gift for math, and an accent Parisians mocked like a low-budget villain in a soap opera. By the time he was 35, he was ruling most of Europe. What happened in between? Strategy, ambition, and more ego than the Louvre has marble statues. Napoleon's rise began during the French Revolution, when France, in a bid to become a republic, accidentally became the world's most chaotic soap opera. Heads were rolling literally, monarchs were fleeing, and armies were at the gates. Amid this chaos, young Napoleon stood out, not just for his military brilliance, but because he actually seemed to win battles, a rare and valuable trait at the time. In 1796, he led the Italian campaign, where he whipped the ragged French army into shape, and then thrashed the Austrians like a man trying to speedrun Europe. He returned home a national hero, with enough propaganda portraits to start a museum. Then came Egypt. Napoleon, thinking why not, decided to invade Egypt to disrupt British trade. He won some battles, lost others, discovered the Rosetta Stone, and then left his troops behind, like a man ghosting a bad date with history. But back in France, his PR machine spun the whole thing as a masterstroke of genius. Napoleon didn't just rewrite military strategy, he rewrote his own press releases. By 1799, with France still unstable, Napoleon pulled off a coup d'état and made himself first consul, which is fancy French for "I'm in charge now." In 1804, he leveled up once more by declaring himself Emperor of the French. But here's the kicker. During the coronation ceremony, instead of waiting for the Pope to crown him like a good Catholic monarch, Napoleon grabbed the crown and placed it on his own head. Nothing screams trust issues like stealing your own coronation. Now Emperor, Napoleon kicked off a tour of Europe that can only be described as the world's angriest sightseeing trip. He restructured governments, redrew borders, and issued the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework that still influences countries today. Civil rights, property laws, centralized bureaucracy. He laid the foundation for modern states, all while wearing enough gold to fund a small kingdom. But he wasn't just a bureaucrat in epaulets. Napoleon was a military genius. His strategies are still studied in military academies. He mastered the art of speed, surprise, and split-second timing. At Austerlitz in 1805, he crushed Russian and Austrian forces in a textbook-perfect battle that made other generals consider alternative careers like goat herding. However, like many men who think they're invincible, Napoleon eventually thought, why not invade Russia? Spoiler: there's a reason generals traditionally avoid winter in Russia. His 1812 invasion began with nearly 600,000 men. By the time he limped out of the snow, frostbite, and guerrilla attacks, fewer than 100,000 remained. Napoleon didn't just lose an army, he lost momentum. His enemies pounced. A coalition of European powers drove him back, and in 1814 Napoleon was forced to abdicate. They exiled him to Elba, a tiny island off the coast of Italy, where he was given a house, a garden, and way too much free time. But here's where Napoleon does something very Napoleon. He escaped. In 1815 he landed back in France, rallied an army in less than 20 days, and reclaimed his throne without firing a shot. The old monarchs, hearing this, collectively screamed into their powdered wigs. Napoleon was back again, for what became known as the 100 Days. Unfortunately for him, the encore ended with a Waterloo, literally, at the Battle of Waterloo. A combined British and Prussian force under the Duke of Wellington finally defeated him. It was a long, messy, mud-soaked slugfest that crushed Napoleon's dream of eternal empire and launched 1,000 metaphors for defeat. This time, the Allies weren't playing. They exiled him to St. Helena, a wind-blasted speck in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean, so remote even seagulls probably refused to visit. There, under British supervision, Napoleon lived out his final years writing memoirs, arguing with his jailers, and presumably yelling at clouds. He died in 1821, possibly from stomach cancer, possibly from arsenic-laced wallpaper, depending on which theory you subscribe to. Either way, he exited as dramatically as he had lived, buried far from France, until his body was brought back in 1840 to be interred at Les Invalides in Paris, under a dome so big it basically screams, "My legacy is heavier than your legacy." Today, Napoleon's reputation is a paradox wrapped in a bicorn hat. Was he a tyrant or a reformer, a warmonger or a visionary? The answer, inconveniently, is yes. He built modern institutions while trampling ancient empires. He spread equality and also crowned himself. He gave Europe new laws, and a reason to build coalitions specifically to stop him. One thing is certain, he made sure history would never forget him, which is why, 2 centuries later, we're still talking about the Corsican artillery officer who rewrote Europe with ambition, brilliance, and just a dash of imperial drama. If history were a talent show, King George III would be the contestant who walked in confidently, fumbled the opening number, got booed off stage by 13 colonies, and spent the rest of the episode muttering in the dressing room. And yet, behind the powdered wigs, tax stamps and dramatic declarations of independence, George III was far more complex than the cartoonish villain American textbooks sometimes make him out to be. Let's start with the obvious. He's the king who lost America. That's a pretty big asterisk to have next to your royal resume. It's like being the chef who accidentally set fire to the kitchen and the dining room, and also invented a new restaurant down the street without meaning to. But while George III gets blamed for the American Revolution like he personally threw tea into Boston Harbor, the truth is messier, more tragic, and oddly enough, more human. Born in 1738, George became king at just 22 years old. He was the first Hanoverian monarch to be born in England, speak fluent English, and actually care about governing. Unlike his German-speaking predecessors, George tried to be a hands-on monarch, and that's where things started to get a little wobbly. George was earnest, dutiful, and deeply devoted to the idea of monarchy. He loved farming, hated flashy spending, and once had his own cowman to supervise his royal dairy. You know, the real power moves. He also had a strong moral compass, devoted to his wife, Queen Charlotte, and the father of 15 children. He tried to be a responsible paternal king, which is great in theory, until your children start a democracy and call you a tyrant. The trouble with America wasn't entirely George's fault. The British Empire, post 7 Years' War, was broke. Like, please don't look at the ledger broke. Parliament decided that since the colonies had benefited from British protection, maybe they should help foot the bill. Enter the infamous taxes, the Stamp Act, Tea Act, and all the other legislative nicknames that sparked bonfires and protest slogans across New England. George supported Parliament's authority, but not necessarily because he was power-hungry. In his mind, Britain had every right to govern and tax its colonies. The idea that Americans could be British citizens while rejecting British law was to him completely illogical. So when the colonies protested, George doubled down. The result? A Declaration of Independence, filled with complaints about how George III had behaved like a tyrant. He has kept among us in times of peace, standing armies. He has imposed taxes without our consent. He has cut off our trade. The Founding Fathers' breakup letter was long, fiery, and pulled absolutely no punches. To be fair, George did sign off on military actions that didn't go well. From Bunker Hill to Yorktown, Britain underestimated the American appetite for self-governance and overestimated how many redcoats it would take to silence it. Spoiler: a lot. By 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially recognized American independence, and George became known forevermore as the monarch who let an empire slip through his fingers like so much unsweetened tea. And while this alone would be enough to secure a spot in history's blooper reel, George's story took a darker turn. In the years following America's independence, George began to suffer from episodes of what was then described as madness. Modern historians believe he likely had porphyria, a rare blood disorder that can cause confusion, paranoia, and hallucinations. During his worst episodes, George would reportedly talk for hours without pause, write rambling letters, and once even tried to shake hands with a tree because he believed it was the King of Prussia. It's funny in a tragic Shakespearean way, like watching King Lear, but with redcoats and better dental care. Despite this, George III wasn't deposed or executed. This wasn't France after all. His cousin Louis XVI across the channel found out that the hard way. Instead, George was quietly sidelined. By 1811, after another mental breakdown, his son officially became Prince Regent, ruling in his place. George spent the last 9 years of his life, blind, deaf, and deeply ill, living in a kind of royal isolation, while the world moved on without him. And yet, in Britain, George III is remembered far more kindly than you'd expect. He oversaw the defeat of Napoleon, though technically under the Regency, supported the arts, expanded the royal collection, and was the monarch during a period of great scientific and industrial progress. Despite losing America, the rest of his empire continued to grow, and his attempts at reform, especially in finance and moral standards, laid the groundwork for future monarchs. Today, George III's legacy depends entirely on where you're standing. In the United States, he's often portrayed as the scowling royal boogeyman from Revolutionary War lore, a bit stiff, a bit shouty, and totally out of touch. In the UK, he's more of a tragic, misunderstood figure, a king who tried to do the right thing and got buried under the weight of his own ideals. In the end, George III didn't lose America because he was evil. He lost it because he was rigid in a world that was changing fast. His story reminds us that even the most powerful men can be both sincere and stubborn, well-meaning and wildly miscalculated. And also, he indirectly helped birth a country that would go on to invent hamburgers, blue jeans, and exploding birthday cakes. So, thanks, George. Let's talk about the history of the alarm clock. Humanity's war against sleeping in. Before the shriek of modern alarms ripped people from their dreams, and long before smartphones whispered condescendingly that you only got 4 hours of sleep, people had to wake up the hard way, listening to water slowly drip into a bowl until it triggered a mechanical guilt trip. Yes, long before we could complain about snooze buttons or oversleeping by accident, the ancient world built alarm clocks out of pottery, water, and what must have been an irrational level of optimism. Behold, the clepsydra, otherwise known as the water clock, the ancient snooze machine that couldn't snooze. The earliest versions of water clocks show up in ancient Egypt and Babylon, around 1500 BCE. The basic concept: you take a container with a small hole in the bottom and let water slowly drip out, or in, marking time by the rising or falling water level. That's it. That was your clock. Not exactly cutting edge, but hey, nobody had invented ticking yet. Now, in fairness, these weren't made for sleepy peasants trying to wake up for work. They were often used in temples and courts, where priests and judges needed to measure things like speech time. Yes, the ancient version of your time is up, counselor. It was the world's first attempt at timekeeping, and probably also the first time someone muttered, "Is this thing even working?" But the ancient Greeks, those overachievers in togas, took things a step further. Enter Stetis, the Einstein of leak technology. In the 3rd century BCE, along comes Ctesias of Alexandria, a man who looked at a bowl of dripping water and thought, this could be way more complicated. And oh, he delivered. Ctesibius was a Greek engineer, mathematician, and the unofficial patron saint of over-engineering. He added gears, pulleys, floats, levers, and even sound effects to the basic water clock. His version wasn't just a timekeeper, it was a full-blown mechanical performance. One of his clocks included little pebbles that would drop onto a gong at regular intervals, essentially giving you an early version of an alarm. Another had automated figurines that moved at specific times, just in case you weren't awake yet and needed a small stone man to shame you out of bed. This wasn't just telling time, this was announcing it with flair. It was the ancient world's equivalent of waking up to a Rube Goldberg machine that spills coffee on your face while yelling, "The sun is up." Lazy bones. The catch: you couldn't take it with you. There's a reason nobody carried these things around. Water clocks were big, messy, and had to be monitored constantly to make sure they didn't run dry or overflow. Imagine trying to travel with one. You'd need a cart, a team of slaves, and a really convincing reason why your clock was leaking on the priest's sandals. These clocks also didn't do too well in winter. Water likes to freeze, or in places where gravity wasn't cooperating. Basically, if the floor wasn't perfectly level or your water had too many minerals in it, congratulations, you just invented a mud puddle instead of an alarm. And then there's the noise, or lack thereof. Sure, Ctesibius's fancy version made some pebbly noise, but most early water clocks were as quiet as a philosopher's sigh, which means your alarm could go off, and you'd sleep right through it, dreaming of rivers, waterfalls, and very persistent leaking sounds. It told you when to wake up, assuming you didn't sleep through the soft gurgle of disappointment. Time was fluid, literally. It's worth remembering that time in the ancient world wasn't always standardized like it is today. Some water clocks had seasonal markings, since hours were longer in the summer and shorter in the winter. So depending on the time of year, your 7 a.m. could either be just after sunrise or basically brunch. In other words, even your alarm clock couldn't give you a straight answer. One day, it woke you up before dawn. The next day, it let you sleep in and blamed the solstice. Water clocks were a noble attempt. They dripped, they spilled, they tried. And while they weren't particularly reliable, they were our first real effort to tame time and to drag ourselves out of bed with something less aggressive than screaming. Eventually, we'd invent bells, gears, and later, soul-shattering phone alarms. But it all started with water, clay pots, and a dream to wake up on time, occasionally. Long before the soothing glow of phone screens and the shrill war cry of digital alarms, there was a time when your only hope of waking up on time was trusting fire not to kill you in your sleep. Welcome to medieval Europe, where monks set the tone for daily discipline by inventing a timekeeping system that doubled as an open flame and a gentle threat. These weren't just candles, these were candle clocks, the original wake up and smell the smoke routine. Picture this: you're a monk in the 12th century. Your life revolves around prayer, silence, and not catching fire. You've taken a vow of obedience, which means when the abbot says midnight prayers, you better be up by midnight, even if your body is begging you to let the dark hours remain blissfully unconscious. There were no clocks on the wall, no sunrise indicators, and absolutely no just 5 more minutes. So what did you rely on? A carefully measured candle that burned down with medieval precision, or at least what they believed was precision. Candle clocks worked like this. A large candle would be marked at regular intervals, usually 1 mark per hour. As the wax burned down past each line, time passed. Sometimes, a small metal ball or wire would be embedded at a specific point. As the candle melted, the object would drop, hitting a metal plate or a tiny bell with just enough noise to wake the faithful, or at least those sleeping lightly near it. If your spiritual duties required you to be awake for the matins, the first of the canonical hours, often scheduled well before dawn, then you didn't argue with the candle, you just got up. Grumpily, the genius and insanity of this system was that it was both elegant and deeply unreliable. Candle wax doesn't always burn at a perfectly consistent rate. Drafts, impurities in the wax, temperature, humidity, or even a slightly wonky wick could speed up or slow down the burn, which meant some monks woke up early, some woke up late, and some woke up to the smell of a scorched wooden altar. Accuracy? Optional. Divine intention? Heavily implied. Yet despite its flaws, the candle clock had charm. It was quiet, portable, and pretty low-tech, in a world where the most advanced piece of equipment in a monastery was probably the scriptorium's feather quill. It didn't require gears, pendulums, or a maintenance crew, just fire and faith. And while we now recognize that candles can't really compete with quartz timing or atomic synchronization, at the time they were revolutionary. You could, in theory, know the time at night, a minor miracle in a world lit by moonlight, torches, and whatever happened to still be burning. Monastic schedules were brutal. A Benedictine monk's daily rhythm involved waking several times through the night to pray. They didn't do this because they were insomniacs or had nothing better to do. They believed that time itself belonged to God, and slicing it up into prayer blocks was a sacred duty. So when your schedule is wake up, chant, repeat for 60 years, you need a system. And since bells required someone to ring them, and sundials were about as useful at night as a bat with a blindfold, candles were the next best thing. And then came the inevitable design improvements. Some clever souls tried attaching weights to the candle, so that as it burned, the wax would slowly release tension and cause the weight to drop, ringing a bell or banging a chime. It was alarm clock meets medieval trebuchet. Others took it a step further by using multiple candles arranged to light each other in succession, creating a horrifying relay race of potential house fires. This system made its way beyond monasteries too. Merchants and travelers sometimes used candle clocks to track appointments, cooking times, or nighttime activities. Romantic poets probably used them to track the passage of time while writing odes to a moon they couldn't actually see through the fog. But while the rest of the world dabbled, it was the monks who took candle clocks seriously. Because when eternal salvation is on the line, punctuality becomes a religious obligation. Of course, the risks were obvious. You're literally sleeping next to open flame. Fire safety, in the medieval world, ranked somewhere between non-existent and actively flammable. Whole monasteries burned down due to unattended candles. It was a hazard everyone accepted, mostly because the alternatives were worse. And let's be honest, monks weren't exactly living thrilling, high-risk lives. If the most dangerous part of your day was a flaming prayer schedule, you were already doing better than the peasants getting kicked by livestock. The candle clock's era eventually waned as more reliable mechanical solutions emerged, but it left its mark. It proved that people were willing to balance fire and sleep in the name of discipline, order, and devotion. And honestly, that level of dedication deserves some credit. They didn't just get up early, they got up early on purpose, using a flaming stick of wax as both timekeeper and existential threat. So the next time your phone alarm screams at you at 6 a.m., just remember, somewhere, 800 years ago, a monk was waking up at the exact same time to the gentle sound of wax giving way and the looming possibility of combustion. There was a time when no one had a personal alarm clock, no smartphone, no bedside screeching box designed by sadists, and yet somehow, people still managed to wake up. How? With a system so loud, so impossible to ignore, and so tied to eternal salvation, that even the sleepiest soul would eventually drag themselves out of bed. The church bell. In medieval and early modern Europe, the soundscape of your day was not chirping birds or your Apple Watch buzzing. It was bells, big ones, on towers, often rung by someone whose arm strength could shatter boulders. These bells weren't just timekeepers, they were daily life's all-encompassing metronome, marking the hours, the prayers, the meals, and occasionally your moral failure to show up on time. Back then, owning a personal timepiece was about as likely as owning a unicorn. Clocks, if they existed in your town at all, were massive public works of clanging machinery and divine intimidation. The average villager didn't know the time unless they could hear it shouted at them in the form of a resounding bronze bong from atop the church tower. And if you lived too far from the church to hear it, well, tough luck. Either you guessed, asked someone wealthier, or just followed the sun like a confused rooster. Churches didn't just toll the hour, they owned the hour. Time in this period wasn't secular or personal. It was a tool of religious control. The church bell told you when to wake, when to pray, when to stop praying, when to work, and when to pretend you weren't still working after dark. These weren't mere reminders. These were holy alarms, where being late wasn't just socially awkward, it was spiritually questionable, and they were loud, really loud. These bells were cast from tons of metal, suspended in dizzyingly tall towers, and when they rang, they didn't just echo through the village, they rattled your ribs. There was no ignoring them, no silencing them, no sticking them under your pillow and hoping they'd go away. When a church bell rang, it rang for you. It rang for everyone. And if you were still lying in bed after the third bell, congratulations, you were now late in the eyes of your boss, your neighbors, and probably God. Your alarm was basically your church yelling at you, spiritually and literally. The system had no snooze button, no grace period. You were either there, or you were going to be asked later why you weren't. And if you had the audacity to miss morning prayers, don't worry. The bells would handle the shame. You'd hear them tolling as you fumbled your boots on, and with every thunderous clang, you could practically feel the disappointment of 1,000 saints judging your punctuality. Miss morning prayers? Don't worry. The bells will shame you into repentance. And this was no small thing. In towns where religion structured every hour of daily life, missing even one call to prayer could cast doubts on your character. In some communities, bells rang 7 or more times a day for various religious observances. The Angelus, rung at dawn, noon and dusk, was essentially a spiritual punch clock. If you weren't pausing to bow your head when the bells rang, people noticed, and not kindly. This was, effectively, the world's first shared alarm system. Forget personalized settings. This was one size blasts all. Everyone in town heard the same clang at the same time, and was expected to act accordingly. It was a kind of forced unity, powered by acoustics and fear of damnation. Late for your bakery shift? The bells knew. Didn't stop work during the evening call to prayer? The bells heard. Thinking about sleeping in on a Sunday? Nice try, sinner. The bells are coming. Even the invention of mechanical tower clocks, which emerged in the 14th century, didn't change the dynamic much at first. Sure, now the bells rang with slightly more regularity, thanks to gears, weights, and early automation. But the sense of external control over time remained. It wasn't until much later, when smaller clocks became affordable, that people could even begin to think about time as something they could manage themselves. Until then, time was something done to you. Interestingly, this bell-based timekeeping also contributed to early labor discipline. In cities, bell towers marked the start and end of the working day, and factories and workshops aligned their routines to these tolls. It was the original punch-in system, and let's be honest, hearing a deafening bell instead of checking your watch is a pretty solid way to make sure no one's slacking off. Some bell towers became symbols of prestige. Cities competed for the tallest, most elaborate timepieces, turning what began as a humble tool of piety into a kind of civic arms race. Oh, your bell chimes hourly. Cute. Ours chimes every 15 minutes and plays a hymn. Step it up, Bruges. Still, the emotional relationship between people and bells never strayed too far from obligation. Bells didn't ask, they commanded. They rang for births, deaths, prayers, warnings, weddings, wars, and yes, waking up. And even today, many churches still ring bells to mark the hour, a lingering reminder that at one point, the only way people knew it was time to move was if a 500-pound chunk of metal declared it so. So next time you complain about your morning alarm, remember, it could be worse. It could be a 2-ton bell shaking your soul awake from a church tower, while your neighbors glance at your empty seat and silently judge you for loving sleep more than salvation. Before the comforting or soul-crushing scream of alarm clocks filled bedrooms across the globe, and long before your phone decided to wake you up with cheerful bird sounds and aggressive screen brightness, waking up on time in industrial Britain required a far stranger solution: hiring another human being to come bang on your window like a socially sanctioned creep. That's right, meet the knocker-upper, a real profession where someone was paid to be your personal very low-tech alarm clock. It sounds like a Dickensian fever dream, but during the 19th and early 20th centuries, especially in the booming factory towns of northern England and parts of Ireland, the knocker-upper was a vital part of working-class life. In a world where being late to your shift could mean losing a day's wages, or worse, your job entirely, people were desperate for any way to guarantee they'd be up before dawn. And when alarm clocks were too expensive, unreliable, or simply non-existent in most working-class homes, the solution was obvious: just hire a human being to aggressively annoy you into wakefulness. These human alarm clocks had one task: wake you up. No apps, no snooze button, just tap, 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 or in some cases, whack, whack, whack. The most basic version involved walking around the neighborhood at ungodly hours carrying a long stick, sometimes bamboo, sometimes metal, and rapping on upper floor windows until the poor, groggy soul inside stirred, waved, or shouted a barely coherent insult through the glass. Some knocker-uppers took it up a notch. They'd use pea shooters, yes, literal pipes that fired dried peas at bedroom windows. It wasn't violent, but it was startling enough to jolt you out of your Victorian slumber and wonder if birds were staging a revolt. The sound was sharp, the method was precise, and best of all, it didn't break windows, usually. Imagine being so tired you need to pay someone to aggressively annoy you awake. The job itself wasn't glamorous. It often involved walking miles in the early morning darkness, through fog, rain, soot, and horse poop. And since factories started early, really early, knocker-uppers had to be up at insane hours, sometimes as early as 3 a.m, to start their rounds. Many of them were elderly men or women supplementing their meager pensions, while others were younger people working side hustles. Some became local legends in their towns, with long client lists, signature tapping styles, and dedicated routes. Ironically, one of the greatest mysteries of the profession was who woke up the knocker-uppers, because if you're the one waking everyone else, there's no one knocking on your window with a stick and a sense of vengeance. It's like being a barista who never gets coffee. Most knocker-uppers relied on their own inner clocks, trained routines, or simply never really slept, which might explain the faint homicidal undertone in their window tapping. These folks didn't enjoy waking people up, they just hated being up alone. And yes, the job did require actual skill. A good knocker-upper knew which windows belonged to which clients. Some lived in tenement buildings with rows of near-identical windows, and one wrong knock could earn you a nasty stare, or, in the best-case scenario, a half-rotten cabbage tossed from a third-story window. Timing also mattered. Knocker-uppers had to be precise. Waking someone too early meant getting cursed. Waking them too late meant getting really cursed, possibly in iambic pentameter. One of the most famous knocker-uppers was a woman named Mary Smith, who worked in East London and specialised in shooting peas at windows with military accuracy. She even got featured in old photographs, looking half exhausted, half unamused, holding a tube like she was ready to go to war with your slumber. Her story, and others like hers, show just how normalised this role had become. No one thought it was strange that grown adults were hiring tiny assassins of sleep to pelt their glass at dawn. Interestingly, in some towns, the local police force also doubled as knocker-uppers. On patrol at night, they'd give a knock or two to paying residents. Imagine your local cop now swinging by your house at 4:45 a.m., giving your window a firm tap, then walking off like it was just part of the beat. Not terrifying at all. But as with most quirky jobs from the past, technology eventually ruined the fun. By the 1930s and 40s, alarm clocks became cheaper and more reliable. The knocker-upper profession started to fade. A few stubborn ones held out into the 1950s in parts of northern England, serving older clients who either didn't trust newfangled gadgets or just liked the personal touch of being harassed awake by someone with a walking stick and zero remorse. Still, their legacy is bizarrely charming. In an age before automation, we relied on people power, grumpy, punctual, possibly damp people with sticks and no mercy. It was loud, inefficient, and probably annoying for the neighbours, but it worked. If you were awake in industrial Britain before sunrise, it was either because of sheer discipline or because someone outside your window had a pea shooter and a schedule to keep. So far in our journey through the awkward evolution of alarm clocks, we've met dripping pots, flaming prayer sticks, bell-wielding churches, and people with sticks who were paid to aggressively knock you into consciousness. But now we've arrived at a pivotal moment in history, when humanity collectively said, what if, instead of fire or strangers with pea shooters, we just build something mechanical, something that clangs with purpose? Enter the mechanical alarm clock, a marvel of gears, springs, and bad mornings. This was when waking up got industrialized, standardized, and most importantly, mass-produced despair. But before we dive into the golden age of ringing contraptions, let's take a moment to appreciate the strange brilliance of Levi Hutchins, a New Hampshire clockmaker who in 1787 created what is often credited as the first American mechanical alarm clock. It had one simple purpose: to wake Levi up at 4 a.m. every single day. Now, let's pause here. This wasn't a general-purpose clock that could be set for any hour. No, it was a bespoke creation, lovingly handcrafted to ring at exactly 4 a.m., because Levi believed that was the correct time to start his day. There were no adjustment knobs, no setting switches, just one time, one ring, one level of suffering. His invention was genius, but also a curse. It only woke you up at 4 a.m. every day, no exceptions, no snooze, just despair. In essence, Levi invented the world's first robotic morning person, and then locked it in that mode forever. His invention didn't catch on immediately, possibly because the rest of the world was still trying to enjoy sleep, but it planted the seed. Over the next few decades, inventors across Europe and America began experimenting with ways to build adjustable wind-up alarm mechanisms that could be mass-produced. And as the 19th century wore on, spurred by the rise of factory schedules, train timetables, and general Victorian guilt, the demand for reliable timekeeping skyrocketed. By the mid to late 1800s, the first adjustable mechanical alarm clocks were appearing. These devices used a combination of springs, gears, and hammer mechanisms to ring a bell at the designated time. The user could turn a small dial or lever to set the alarm, wind up the mechanism, and then, if they were lucky, get jolted out of bed by a sound that could only be described as two angry spoons in a blender. The invention of these clocks was met with joy, skepticism, and probably a lot of grumbling. On one hand, they were a game changer. You no longer had to rely on monks, churches, or that weird guy who tapped windows with a stick. You could own your own private misery machine, right on your nightstand. On the other hand, the early versions were not what you'd call subtle. These clocks didn't just ring, they attacked. The bells were mounted on top of the clock, like tiny metallic fists of vengeance, and when the alarm was triggered, they would shake and rattle with the energy of 1,000 caffeinated squirrels. There was no gentle chime, no fading crescendo, just an abrupt, soul-rattling clang that declared, "Sleep is over. You had your chance." It was the beginning of something beautiful and deeply hated. As technology improved, alarm clocks got fancier. Some included two bells, positioned on either side of the hammer, making twice the noise. Others were housed in stylish cases, designed to look more elegant, as if a nice wood finish could soften the emotional trauma of being yanked out of dreams by a mechanical banshee. But it wasn't just about personal use. Factories and offices began incorporating alarm clocks into routines. The concept of being on time became linked to morality and productivity. Punctuality was now not only a virtue, it was expected, and the alarm clock was the tool to enforce it. Employers loved them. Workers, not so much. Still, as dreadful as they were, these devices became essential. They were sturdy, reliable, and brutally effective. Entire companies sprang up to produce them. In the United States, West clocks became a household name, churning out millions of alarm clocks by the early 20th century. Their clocks became the weapon of choice for tired students, harried businessmen, and groggy parents across the nation. Mechanical alarm clocks weren't perfect. They needed to be wound daily. They occasionally failed, and if you forgot to wind it before bed, well, hope you enjoy unemployment. But they were dependable enough to reshape the human relationship with sleep. No longer were you rising with the sun or listening for distant bells. Now, time belonged to the clanging horror on your dresser. And if you think this era lacked creativity, think again. Some inventors added bells that got louder over time, extra hammers, or even mechanisms that made the clock roll away from you, forcing you to get out of bed to turn it off. Because if the alarm couldn't wake you, maybe frustration could. This was the golden age of analog annoyance, a period when alarm clocks were less a convenience and more of a declaration of war on comfort. And yet, we bought them, we used them, we hated them, but most of all, we trusted them. After all, what better way to start your day than with a burst of mechanical violence and the bitter reminder that time waits for no one? As humanity marched into the 20th century, we accomplished many great things, splitting the atom, landing on the moon, inventing cheese in a can, but arguably none of these rivaled the moment we created the ultimate symbol of denial, the snooze button. A tiny slab of plastic that sits on your alarm clock like a deceptive little gremlin, whispering, "Hey, you've got time, hit me. Just 5 more minutes won't hurt anyone." And we listen. Oh, how we listen. At its core, the snooze button represents an unholy alliance between hope and laziness. It promises comfort, offers illusion, and delivers exactly 0 actual rest. It exists not to help us sleep longer, but to give us permission to procrastinate verticality with micro naps of increasing panic. The snooze button, invented so you could lie to yourself 9 times in a row. This brilliant piece of engineering made its mainstream debut in the mid-20th century, as clockmakers decided that what the world really needed was a way to wake up wrong more gradually. Originally, alarms were binary on or off. There was no middle ground. The bell rang, you suffered, and the day began. But when someone, likely a sleep-deprived engineer with a love for human suffering, introduced the repeating delay function, a whole new era of passive-aggressive mornings was born. The standard snooze interval, 9 minutes, wasn't chosen by science, psychology, or divine revelation. It was chosen because it was just long enough to feel indulgent, but short enough to keep people from falling into deep sleep again. It was also partly due to mechanical limitations of the gears inside early alarm clocks. 9 minutes was the compromise between mechanical simplicity and human delusion. And so began the universal ritual: alarm rings. You groan, you slap, you roll over and think, "I'm just going to rest my eyes." 8 minutes and 59 seconds later, betrayal. The alarm returns like an overzealous boomerang, and you once again find yourself contemplating the meaning of time, existence, and why your blanket suddenly feels like it's made of heaven. This cycle repeats itself. For some people, once. For others, 7 to 12 times. By the 5th snooze, you're not even asleep anymore. You're just lying there, angry at a machine you willingly set up to ruin your morning. You've started your day with a trust exercise you always fail, and somehow you do it again the next day. Nothing builds character like waking up in a panic, slapping plastic, and falling back into dreams about being late. This sleep masquerading as rest actually has a name: fragmented sleep, which scientists agree is one of the worst ways to start your day. You're not getting rest. You're not entering REM. You're just lying there, flirting with unconsciousness, while cortisol slowly brews in your bloodstream like a stress espresso. The snooze button isn't relaxing. It's psychological Russian roulette. But even knowing all this, humans doubled down. Not only did we embrace snooze buttons, we escalated them. Enter the age of creative cruelty. Alarms that roll off your nightstand and make you chase them across the room. Alarms that fly around your bedroom like angry bees with propellers. Alarms that force you to solve math problems, recite facts, or even take a picture of your bathroom sink to prove you're awake. Yes, someone somewhere said, let's combine waking up with homework and cardio. And these aren't fringe novelties, they sell. Millions of people voluntarily buy mobile screaming objects because we know we're weak in the morning. Alarm clocks are no longer time-telling devices, they're psychological warfare tools. They scream, run, vibrate, flash, and guilt trip you into existence. Because without such force, we'd sleep through everything short of an actual fire. And let's be honest, maybe even that. The rise of smartphone alarms only made the problem worse. Now we have apps with custom snooze intervals, soothing tones, aggressive tones, voices that gently whisper your name or demand your soul. You can wake up to ocean waves, a rooster, a motivational quote, or, if you're a masochist, your boss's voice. And yet, despite this smorgasbord of options, most of us still go with the default alarm, the one that sounds like a fire drill inside a robot factory. Because at this point, we've given up trying to make it pleasant, we just want it to end. Still, in a weird way, the snooze button is comforting. It gives us the illusion of control. Even if it's a lie, it's our lie. We know those 9 minutes won't save us. We know we're risking being late, missing the bus, showing up to work with pillow creases etched into our souls. But we still press it, because for just one more moment, we get to choose sleep. Even if that choice leads directly to chaos. So next time your alarm goes off and your hand instinctively shoots out to silence it, remember, you're not alone. Billions of people around the world are doing the same, nodding off for the 4th time, making mental deals with the universe that start with, if I get up in 5 minutes, I'll definitely work out tonight. We won't. But hey, let us dream. If Levi Hutchins could time travel from 1787 to today and witness the modern state of alarm clocks, he'd likely stare in stunned horror and say, why does this rectangle know your sleep patterns better than your spouse? Welcome to the 21st century, where alarm clocks have transformed from simple timekeepers into hyper-connected, all-knowing sleep snitches. They no longer just wake you up, they track you, analyze you, scold you, and sometimes even recommend breathing exercises to improve your vibe. We have entered the golden age of judgmental technology. You don't just set a time anymore. You download an app, connect it to a smartwatch, agree to give it access to your resting heart rate, and allow it to whisper sweet shaming statistics into your ear each morning. You slept for 5 hours and 32 minutes. You woke up 4 times. You had 37 minutes of REM sleep. Also, you might die tired. Now your alarm doesn't just wake you up. It checks your heartbeat, scolds you for poor sleep hygiene, and suggests you meditate. It's basically your mother. Modern alarms come in many flavors, none of them subtle. There are apps that require you to solve math problems before they'll shut off. Want to stop the buzzing? Enjoy calculating 13 times 27 with one eye open while trying not to cry. Others force you to take a selfie in the same location every morning to prove you're actually out of bed. Still more demand you shake the phone violently like a maraca until it decides you've earned silence. Congratulations. Your morning now begins with a full-body workout and mild existential dread. And then there are the smart alarms. These little digital masterminds don't just ring, they watch. They analyze your movements, your breathing, and your REM cycles, using motion sensors or microphones to determine when you're in your lightest stage of sleep. Then they pick the ideal moment within a 30-minute window to gently rouse you, because who wouldn't want to be woken up by a machine whispering, "Now is optimal," based on your circadian rhythm and shameful snacking habits. These alarms have become sleep coaches with zero bedside manners. You didn't just sleep badly, you performed poorly. Your sleep score is a dismal 62 out of 100. And don't worry, the app's happy to graph your failures in pastel colors. And just when you think you're safe, you open your phone to find notifications like, "You slept 4 hours last night. Want to start a meditation routine?" No. I want to not be judged by software with a cartoon owl mascot. Meanwhile, social media has gleefully joined the chaos. TikTokers now wake up to anime voice alarms, K-pop shoutouts, or custom alerts that scream "rise and grind" like a caffeinated drill sergeant. Some folks set their alarms to songs so aggressively cheerful they make you want to delete happiness itself. Others take the opposite route and set terrifying horror soundtracks to jolt themselves out of bed like they're escaping a haunted mansion. It's a choose-your-own nightmare system, and people love it. Smart assistants like Alexa, Google Assistant, and Siri have also gotten in on the action. You can now say, "Wake me up at 6 a.m," and your bedside robot will not only do so, but also remind you to hydrate, suggest a breakfast recipe, and give you the weather forecast for your daily existential crisis. The future is here, and it has opinions. You can snooze it, you can yell at it, but let's face it, you're still getting up 5 minutes before your first Zoom call. And speaking of Zoom calls, modern alarms may be smarter, but they've also collided headfirst with the age of remote work. Alarms are no longer set to give you time for a commute. They're set to give you just enough time to sit up, throw on a hoodie, and log into a virtual meeting with the camera conveniently off. The era of waking up at 6 a.m. has been replaced by waking up at 8:55 for a 9 o'clock meeting. Coffee in hand, pants questionable. Yet, for all their power and precision, modern alarms still can't solve one age-old problem. You just don't want to get up. You know it's time. Your phone knows it's time. Even your smart pillow is giving you side-eye, but your body, it just wants to be horizontal forever. And no matter how sophisticated the app, how soothing the voice, or how detailed the sleep chart, nothing defeats the simple power of stubborn human willpower to ignore everything and hit snooze anyway. And so we end where we began. Not with a dripping pot or a medieval candle, but with a high-tech rectangle that knows all, sees all, and still has to scream at you every morning to get out of bed. It's faster, smarter, and far more passive-aggressive than anything our ancestors could have imagined. History's worst food trends, from roasted dormice to jelly everything. If you ever thought your local fusion bistro was getting too weird, just remember the ancient Romans beat you to it, and they did it with more enthusiasm, fewer morals, and way more rodents. While they gave the world aqueducts, Latin and indoor plumbing, they also gave us some of the strangest dishes ever conceived. Welcome to the Roman dinner party, where taste was optional, but presentation was everything. Let's start with one of the Roman Empire's most infamous culinary choices, the roasted dormouse, or as they called it, glias. That's right. They ate mice, on purpose, as a delicacy, but not just any mice. These were specially fattened in little jars called glararia, where they were lovingly fed a diet of nuts and acorns, until they became what can only be described as ancient foie gras with whiskers. Once plumped up, these chubby rodents were stuffed with pork, pine nuts and herbs, then roasted until golden and served at elite banquets, because nothing says status like serving stuffed vermin on a silver platter. And to really drive the decadence home, they were often presented reclining on tiny trays, sometimes still fur on for visual flair, as if to say, yes, we caught this in a hedge maze of wealth and bad decisions. If it moved, the Romans probably stuffed it, roasted it, and invited senators to taste test it. But the dormouse was just the opening act. Let's talk garum, the fermented fish sauce that clung to Roman cuisine like a wet toga. Garum wasn't just a condiment. It was a lifestyle, made by packing fish guts, blood, and salt into clay vats and letting it ferment in the sun for months. This pungent ooze was then strained and bottled as the ancient world's equivalent of liquid gold, or liquid regret, depending on your nose. Romans slathered garum on everything: meat, vegetables, fruit. Yes, fruit, and probably themselves in moments of culinary crisis. It was their ketchup, their soy sauce, their magical elixir of flavor, and it reeked. One modern archaeologist described the smell as a cross between anchovies, death, and a very bad idea. Yet, it was such a hot commodity that entire factories were built just to mass-produce this fishy brew. If you've ever walked into a fish market and thought, I wish this could be bottled and poured on toast, congratulations, you're spiritually Roman. Next up, flamingo tongues. Because when you're rich, bored, and surrounded by marble statues, apparently the only logical thing to do is stare at a graceful pink bird and think, let's eat its least edible part. These weren't just flamboyant flex foods, they were considered peak luxury. The tongues were boiled, seasoned with vinegar and honey, and served in decorative dishes to the social elite, who presumably didn't question how many flamingos had to die for one mouthful of status. And don't forget the stuffed so's womb, a recipe proudly included in the oldest surviving Roman cookbook, Apicius. Yes, Someone looked at a pig's reproductive system and thought, you know what this needs, some pepper and eggs. This was also a banquet showstopper. If your guests didn't gasp when the serving tray arrived, were they even Roman? But these weren't random acts of culinary madness. To the Roman elite, food was power. Banquets were social battlegrounds. The stranger the dish, the more impressive the host. If you could serve a peacock in full feather, with its body replaced by spiced sausage and figs, you were winning. If your wine turned blue, with added herbs, and your bread glittered with gold flakes, you weren't feeding your guests, you were dominating them with dinner. What's astonishing is how calculated it all was. Food was tightly tied to Roman class and identity. The average citizen ate grain mush, lentils, and olives, but the upper class, they had live entertainment with their live eels. Dinner was a 6-course performance, and no part of the animal or the social ladder was spared. Even dessert got weird. One popular treat involved deep-fried pastries drizzled in honey and shaped like various animals, because nothing screams end of meal like a bear-shaped cookie made of lard and irony. And while we today might mock these practices from our modern perch of avocado toast and oat milk, let's not pretend we're that different. The Romans had garum. We have ranch dressing in a spray can. They ate dormice. We eat chicken nuggets, shaped like dinosaurs. Every generation has its culinary sins. Theirs just came with better pottery. So next time you're invited to a dinner party, and someone brings a weird dish, take a moment to appreciate the legacy. They may not be serving flamingo tongues or fermenting fish in their backyard, but deep down, we're all just trying to impress our guests without poisoning them. If you've ever opened your fridge and wondered whether that 3-day-old casserole still counts as food or a biohazard, then congratulations, you've already shared a moment with the ancient Egyptians. Except instead of a soggy lasagna, they were dealing with fermented catfish, sacred pigeons, and meat, so well preserved it could attend its own funeral. Egyptian cuisine wasn't just a way to survive in the scorching Nile sun. It was a daily offering to both the stomach and the gods, and while a lot of it was practical, nutritious, and shockingly ahead of its time, let's be honest, some of it sounds like a dare. Let's begin with the beloved Egyptian staple, fermented fish. A dish that was essentially catfish plus time and humidity, and the faint hope that no one would die from eating it. Known as fisik in its modern form, this recipe dates back thousands of years and involved sun-drying, salting, and fermenting fish until it achieved that magical state between delicacy and chemical experiment. This wasn't a spontaneous idea, it was a carefully controlled process, kind of like curing meat, but with more existential risk. Fermented catfish was so significant that archaeologists have found elaborate fish-drying racks in tomb illustrations, suggesting that even in the afterlife, Egyptians believed you might need a bite of something pungent, because nothing completes your eternal journey quite like slightly decomposing Nile seafood. And speaking of meals that flirt with danger, let's talk about pigeon stew. Yes, pigeon. Far from being just sky rats or city mascots of chaos, pigeons in ancient Egypt were actually a highly prized food source. They were domesticated, lovingly fattened, and then served in a warm broth of herbs, vegetables, and maybe a dash of sorry, little buddy. The dish, known today as ham mashi, is still eaten in modern Egypt, but back then, it was a mark of a well-fed household. Of course, not all Egyptian cuisine focused on things that fly or ferment. Some of it was straight-up ingenious. Take their bread-beer hybrids. Truly, the breakfast of pharaohs and peasants alike. The Egyptians brewed beer from partially baked loaves of barley bread, crumbled into vats of water, and left to ferment. This created a thick, porridge-like drink that was simultaneously food, beverage, and party starter. Yes, they drank their bread, and yes, it was often cloudy, gritty, and slightly chewy. Basically the historical equivalent of a protein smoothie no one asked for. But it packed a caloric punch, didn't require teeth, and let's face it, got the job done. After a few mugs of this barley sludge, you wouldn't care what the catfish smelled like. Dinner was either divine or a creative way to reuse yesterday's leftovers for eternity. Now, let's take a brief stroll into the afterlife, because no civilization obsessed over the eternal dining experience, quite like the Egyptians. Not content with merely feeding the living, they were also committed to making sure their dead ate well. Tombs of nobles and pharaohs were filled with mummified meats, carefully preserved offerings intended to feed the spirit in the next world. And we're not talking about symbolic representations or food-shaped clay pots. No, the Egyptians mummified actual cuts of beef, duck, and even ribs, seasoned and wrapped like little meaty sarcophagi. Some meats were even trussed and salted like jerky, others coated in resin to keep them from spoiling, a term used generously here. 1,3,000-year-old slab of beef found in a tomb was so well preserved that scientists could still identify the butcher's cut. That's right, ancient Egypt didn't just invent pyramids, they invented takeout for the afterlife. Of course, all of this culinary creativity was layered with deep symbolism. Certain foods were sacred to particular gods, onions for Ra, lettuce for Min. Yes, lettuce, because it was symbolically virile, and geese for Geb. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was a spiritual transaction. You didn't just eat, you communed with divine flavor. But not everything was epic. The average Egyptian peasant didn't dine on flamingo tongues. Those were for their future Roman conquerors. Instead, they ate lentils, barley, chickpeas, onions, and leeks, usually in the form of a stew or flatbread. It was filling, earthy, and occasionally spiced with crushed dates or honey, if you were lucky. It may not have been fancy, but it kept the builders of pyramids strong enough to haul 2.5-ton limestone blocks, so clearly it worked. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, this all sounds oddly tasty, don't be fooled. While modern Egyptian cuisine is absolutely delicious, its ancient counterpart was often more experimental survival art than culinary masterpiece. Between the pickled fish, the bread that's also beer, and the side of eternal jerky, ancient Egypt serves as a reminder that humanity's quest for flavor has always included a dash of risk and a hint of resurrection. If you've ever wondered what it's like to eat something that tastes like burning rubber marinated in sea ghosts, congratulations. You've just been introduced to crackle, the culinary prank the Vikings left behind as a legacy to confuse modern tourists. Viking cuisine wasn't about flavor, presentation, or subtle spices. It was about staying alive in a freezing wasteland with whatever you could catch, club, or scrape off a rock. These were people who thought winters should be fought with axes and fish that can double as chemical weapons. Let's start with crackle, Iceland's most infamous fermented dish. Though fermented is really just a polite way of saying buried in sand for months until it stops being deadly. Made from Greenland shark. Crackle is an ancient tradition that, even back then, only kind of counted as food. Here's the thing, the Greenland shark's meat is naturally toxic due to high levels of urea and trimethylamine oxide. So naturally, instead of saying, let's eat something else, the Vikings said, let's fix this with decomposition. The process involves gutting the shark, burying it in a shallow grave, placing heavy stones on top to squeeze out fluids, and leaving it to rot. After several months, the meat is dug up, sliced into strips, and hung in a drying shed to air out the demons. The result? A dish that smells like ammonia, has the consistency of damp sponges, and tastes like a Viking dared you to prove your manhood. If it smells like low tide and haunts your dreams, it's probably a Viking delicacy. But crackle wasn't a one-off horror. It was just one highlight in a smorgasbord of Norse nutritional nightmares. Vikings didn't have refrigeration, seasoning was limited, and winter lasted roughly 400 months a year. So preserving food wasn't just helpful, it was survival. Which brings us to blood pancakes. Yes, they are exactly what they sound like. Flat cakes made from animal blood, flour, and just enough herbs to pretend you're cooking. And not just pan-frying the concept of fear. Vikings would drain blood from livestock during slaughter season, mix it with rye flour, and fry it into thick, iron-rich pancakes that were more Dracula brunch than breakfast treat. The nutritional value was actually impressive, full of protein, iron, and enough moral ambiguity to fuel a week of looting. Served hot with sour cream or lingonberries. If you were lucky, these were a common peasant dish, and believe it or not, a comfort food. Nothing says childhood nostalgia like grandma flipping blood patties by the hearth. Now if pancakes made of plasma aren't doing it for you, may I interest you in seal fat snacks. The Norse didn't let anything go to waste, especially not fat, which was one of the most valuable food resources in their diet. Seal blubber was boiled, cured, rendered, and sometimes just eaten raw, often stored in animal stomachs to age. because the only thing better than raw seal fat is fermented, stomach-aged seal fat. This was food with a purpose. Seal fat could be eaten on its own, smeared on dried fish, or shaped into greasy energy cubes. Basically the Viking version of protein bars, and it worked. You try rowing across the North Atlantic with a stomach full of kale. Vikings powered through sub-zero temperatures and dragon ship invasions on fat and fury. Seafood, of course, was a staple of their diet, but not in the candle-lit salmon fillet kind of way. Dried cod, raw herring, whale blubber, and even seabirds were all on the table, literally. Fish were dried until they reached the consistency of roofing shingles, then pounded with hammers before eating, not to tenderize them, just to make them chewable by humans without breaking their jaw. And let's not forget soured milk, or skyr. While today it's sold as Icelandic yogurt and paired with fruit and granola, back then it was a lumpy, tangy dairy product that lived in barrels until it developed both flavor and an attitude. Vikings drank sour whey like it was a morning smoothie, sometimes mixed with blood or herbs, because why start your day with coffee when you can start it with mild suffering? What makes all this even more impressive or alarming is that Viking hospitality was famous. If you were a guest in a Norse household, they'd feed you the best they had, and if the best they had was fermented shark, blood pancakes, and a cup of sour milk, well, welcome to the Longhouse. Wipe your feet and hold your nose. Despite all of this, Viking food was remarkably efficient. It kept people alive in impossible conditions, built empires, and probably scared off a few enemies just by smell alone. It wasn't pretty, but it was practical. These weren't gourmet meals, they were battle rations for people who thought the best way to spend a weekend was raiding England. So the next time you're struggling with an overcooked microwave dinner or a bland protein shake, just remember, it could be worse. You could be chewing on rot shark jerky while the sea slaps your face and your drinking horn smells like goat. If you've ever grabbed a suspicious hot dog from a questionable cart at 2 a.m. and thought, this could kill me, congratulations. You've just time-traveled back to the street food scene of medieval Europe, where eating in public wasn't just a convenience. It was a gamble with intestinal consequences. In the bustling towns of the Middle Ages, food vendors lined narrow, sewage-adjacent alleyways with an irresistible offer, hot, ready-to-eat meals for the working poor. Because when you've spent 12 hours tanning leather, hauling bricks, or surviving feudalism in general, you don't go home and whip up a nice salad. You grab something steaming from a guy with a cart, questionable hygiene, and a surprisingly upbeat attitude. Welcome to the world of mystery pies. These handheld medieval wonders were the fast food of their time, wrapped in thick, dry pastry that could survive a trebuchet attack, and filled with, well, let's call it protein. Sometimes it was mutton, sometimes it was pigeon, sometimes it was whatever meat the vendor had lying around that didn't quite smell wrong yet. And don't ask what part of the animal was used. The only thing you could count on was that the pastry crust was more edible than the surprise waiting inside. Street food was popular, mostly because you couldn't smell it until it was too late. One of the crowd favorites was black pudding, a kind of sausage made from pig's blood, oats, fat, and whatever emotional trauma you hadn't dealt with yet. Sold by the slice, and often kept warm by sitting near a small fire, or just on top of the fire, it was dense, filling, and looked like someone tried to weaponize anemia. Still, it was packed with calories, iron, and street cred among commoners who needed energy and didn't have the luxury of being picky about how liquidy their food once was. But why stop at one sausage horror when there were so many? Enter the wandering sausage vendors, also known as the original hipsters of the medieval food truck scene, minus the ironic beards and health regulations. These vendors peddled sausages made from offcuts of meat, fat, spices, if they could afford any, and generous helpings of breadcrumbs or grain to bulk it out. If you were lucky, it was pork. If you were unlucky, it was not pork. If you were really unlucky, it barked earlier that morning. They were cheap, hot, and best eaten with your eyes closed and your nose pinched. Sometimes the sausage was wrapped in animal intestine. Sometimes it was wrapped in more sausage. The true ingredient list was known only to the butcher, his god, and the rats waiting nearby for leftovers. And if you thought stew might be a safer option, oh dear, you haven't met communal stew pots, also known as eternal pots, because they never stopped cooking. These cauldrons sat in taverns or food stalls and were topped up continuously, day after day, week after week, with new ingredients. Didn't finish yesterday's rat and turnip combo. Toss in today's leeks, a sheep bone, and a splash of ale, and boom, stew of the day. The result was less a meal and more a bubbling medieval ecosystem. No one really knew what was in the bottom anymore. Was it beef? Was it beans? Was it just fate? One bite could be delicious. Another bite could be a chewy surprise that made you rethink your life choices. Now the truth is, this food wasn't born out of culinary ambition. It was born out of necessity. For the average peasant, cooking at home wasn't always an option. Many didn't have their own ovens, and firewood was expensive, so communal baking houses and food stalls became lifelines. People would bring their own dough to be baked in public ovens, or eat directly from whatever smelled least offensive that day. And yes, it smelled. In cities where waste disposal consisted of throw it in the street and walk away, your street meat was often served with a side of airborne regret. Vendors did their best, sometimes covering food with cloth to protect from flies, other times just waving them off with a broom and a prayer. But sanitation? That was more of a concept than a practice. If you didn't catch dysentery from the meal, you were just rolling the dice again tomorrow. Still, there was something uniquely human about it. Vendors shouted their wares, customers haggled, and the air was filled with the rich, greasy aroma of hope and lard. Mostly lard. Despite the risks, street food was the beating heart of medieval urban life. It was fast, affordable, and full of character and bacteria. It fed soldiers, beggars, nobles in disguise, and way too many rats. And let's be honest, deep down there's something oddly comforting about knowing that, even 800 years ago, people were standing in line for something hot, salty, and just a little bit suspicious. So next time you hesitate at a modern street cart, just remember, at least today's meat doesn't come with medieval mystery sauce. Probably, if the Middle Ages were about surviving dinner, the Renaissance was about making it theatrical, poisonous, and just expensive enough to impress people you hated. While peasants across Europe were still choking down onion stew and hoping for a good potato year, the wealthy elite were throwing feasts that looked like performance art and tasted like early retirement for your liver, because nothing screams refinement like eating glitter while slowly being poisoned. Welcome to the Renaissance banquet, where the motto was, if you can't eat the chandelier, you're not trying hard enough. Let's start with gold. Actual, edible gold, not a metaphor. In Renaissance Europe, especially among the Italian and French nobility, it became trendy to decorate food with gold leaf, which is as impractical as it sounds. Gold flakes were delicately applied to roast meats, pastries, fruits, and even sauces. Not because it added flavor, spoiler, it doesn't, but because it sparkled under candlelight and reminded everyone you were richer than God and twice as insecure. Entire banquet dishes were gilded like Fabergé eggs with body dysmorphia, gold-covered apples, gold-dusted boar, and yes, golden marzipan sculptures of mythological beasts. Renaissance chefs weren't just cooking, they were crafting edible jewelry for the emotionally fragile upper class. And if gold wasn't dramatic enough, you could always serve a peacock in its own feathers. That's right, roasted peacock, reassembled post-cooking, so that it looked alive and fabulous on your dining table. The body was roasted, the skin and feathers were carefully removed and preserved during cooking, then redraped over the meat, like a fashion-forward taxidermy illusion. Some hosts even went further, stuffing the peacock with other birds, because the only thing more extravagant than one bird is a turducken's flamboyant great-grandfather. Think swans stuffed with goose, stuffed with chicken, stuffed with quail. Somewhere in there was a breadcrumb, possibly, but who knows. Then there was the wine. Oh, the wine. Naturally, Renaissance people wanted it to taste sweeter, and since sugar was expensive, and wine was often a bit sour, they did what any enterprising poison enthusiast might. They added lead. Yes, lead acetate, charmingly nicknamed sugar of lead, was used to artificially sweeten cheap wine. It worked. It made it sweeter. It also made your kidneys tap out of life by your mid-30s. Nothing says high society like eating glitter while slowly being poisoned. This was especially popular in the Holy Roman Empire, and among the aristocracy, who believed strange symptoms like fatigue, tremors, and brain fog were signs of divine ennui, not aggressive heavy metal poisoning. When your daily diet includes gold, mercury, and wine aged in murder, you don't just get gout, you get Renaissance gout, which probably came with a lute solo. And it wasn't just the ingredients that were ridiculous. Banquet presentation reached levels that would make even modern wedding planners cry. There were dishes that literally exploded, puff pastries rigged with live birds or frogs inside, so when you cut into them, the animals would leap out and send everyone into delighted hysteria or full-on panic, depending on how much wine they'd already consumed. This wasn't food, this was edible theatre, and the guests were both audience and victims. Menus often stretched to 20 courses or more, with subtlety and symbolism baked into each. Your soup might come with a carved bread crust shaped like Hercules. Your dessert might be a replica of Mount Vesuvius made of sugar and icing. One actual royal banquet included a mechanical roast pig that played the trumpet out of its own snout. And yes, it was weird even then, but all of this opulence had a purpose. These feasts weren't just about showing off. They were political weapons. If you could afford to coat your venison in gold and feed pheasant pâté to your guests while musicians played lutes balanced on stilts, you were sending a message: I am rich, powerful, and possibly unhinged. Do not challenge me. Yet underneath all the peacock feathers and edible wealth, the darker truth brewed Renaissance food could kill you slowly and fashionably, not just from heavy metals, but from spoiled ingredients masked with spices, a lack of basic hygiene, and culinary trends that valued spectacle over safety. But hey, if you died at the feast, at least they'd remember you were the guy who served glittering eel mousse inside a pastry unicorn. So next time you scroll past a $30 edible gold donut on Instagram and scoff, just remember the Renaissance walked so modern foodie nonsense could run. Only now, your drink comes with organic cane sugar instead of an autopsy. Ah, France. Birthplace of haute cuisine, sophisticated sauces, and snail appetizers. If you've ever stared at your dinner plate and thought, is it moving? Or is that just the garlic butter? Congratulations, you've spiritually dined with the French. But long before the Michelin stars and tiny tweezers, French cuisine was shaped not by fine linen and wine pairings, but by desperation, improvisation, and a certain willingness to put anything in your mouth if it had enough herbs on it. Let's start with the most famous chewy guest at the French dinner table: escargot, snails, land mollusks, garden slime tubes. Now a pricey delicacy served with tongs and tuxedos, they began as many great food tragedies do as rural peasant food. Why? Because snails are slow, abundant, and so humble they don't even fight back. For farmers in medieval and early modern France, snails were essentially the protein that delivered itself. They were easy to catch, required no feeding unless you wanted to clean their diet before eating them, which is both considerate and faintly terrifying, and could be stored in baskets for weeks. Toss them in a pot, drown them in garlic, butter, parsley, and maybe a splash of wine, and voila, you've got a dish that both nourishes and confuses tourists to this day. French chefs looked at a snail and said, "Put garlic on it, it's food now." Of course, escargot wasn't exactly the toast of Versailles at first. Aristocrats viewed snails as poor people food, slimy, dirty, and vaguely insulting. But then came the golden rule of cuisine. If you want rich people to eat something, make it expensive and serve it on porcelain. By the 18th century, fancy chefs began reinventing escargot with flair, introducing elaborate sauces, presentation, and the ritual of snail forks, which sounds like a medieval torture device, but is somehow still sold at Williams Sonoma. Snail eating went from shameful to chic, and the rest is history. The moral of the story: add enough butter, and you can make slugs feel like success. Now, let's wade into the other swamp-born culinary curveball: frog legs, or cousis de grenouille. For those fluent in frog-related French, much like snails, frogs were a rural resource, a hop away from dinner, if you will. Frogs were abundant, protein-rich, and required little prep if you ignored the whole, it's still twitching part. The French began eating frog legs seriously in the Middle Ages, particularly in religious communities. Why monks? Because in a glorious twist of divine logic, frogs were considered fish by the Catholic Church, meaning they were fair game during fasting days when meat was forbidden. You can't eat beef, the church said. But this amphibian that lives in the mud and screams when touched, bon appetit. Cooked with butter, garlic again, and maybe a little wine. Are you sensing a theme? Frog legs became a tender, crispy treat beloved by rural communities and gradually elevated into fine dining. The upper crust, naturally, followed suit once it became clear the peasants were enjoying themselves too much. By the 18th and 19th centuries, France had fully embraced its edible amphibian identity. Frog legs were showing up in royal menus, Parisian restaurants, and eventually the foreign press, who turned it into a stereotype that still haunts French travelers to this day. Ask any French person who's ever studied abroad in America, and they'll tell you someone somewhere has made a frog joke within 5 minutes of meeting them. But beyond snails and frogs, the French Revolution itself added more than just guillotines to the national character. It reshaped cuisine from the top down. As the aristocracy fled or lost their heads, their personal chefs were suddenly unemployed, but still very skilled. And where did they go? To the streets, to open restaurants, to cook for the bourgeoisie. Et voilà! The modern French restaurant was born. Suddenly, formerly impossible to afford meals were being sold at reasonable prices. Dishes that once graced marble halls now sat on wooden tables in cozy dining rooms. Recipes got passed around, altered, shared. French food evolved, not into something simpler but into something accessible, and yes, sometimes still crawling. The revolutionary era also emphasized resourcefulness. Food shortages meant people had to get creative. This was a time when even the fancy folks learned to use bones for broth, offal for stew, and literally everything else for pâté. Frogs and snails, they weren't weird anymore. They were economic, patriotic, and flavorful in a pinch. And then, like a soufflé rising under political pressure, French cuisine began to refine itself. By the 19th century, chefs like Marie-Antoine Carême and later Auguste Escoffier formalized cooking into a high art. They codified sauces, championed presentation, and helped elevate French food into the culinary Olympus. But deep in the roots of all that truffle foam and duck confit, yep, frogs and snails, and a whole lot of garlic. So the next time you're nervously poking a snail on a tiny silver dish, wondering how something so small smells so strongly of a garden, and a dream of butter, remember this. It started with poor farmers and monks trying to outwit hunger, and somehow ended with tourists pretending to like it for Instagram. That's not just cuisine, it's culture, with slime. If you've ever looked at your dinner plate and thought, I have no idea what this is, but I'm going to eat it, and hope for the best, then congratulations, you've shared a moment with the early American colonists. These were people who crossed the ocean in leaky wooden ships, landed in an unfamiliar wilderness, and immediately had to figure out which animals were edible and which ones were angry about being cooked. Welcome to colonial American cuisine, a chaotic blend of desperation, innovation, and deep spiritual denial about whatever was currently floating in the stew pot. The first European settlers, especially the Puritans and Jamestown crowd, didn't exactly come to the New World with a cookbook. Most of them barely knew how to cook in the Old World, let alone in a place where the ingredients were unfamiliar. The winters tried to kill you, and the local wildlife viewed you as suspicious at best, and lunch at worst. Let's start with stew, because when you don't know how to prepare something, you boil it and hope flavor shows up. Colonial stews were often referred to as pottages, which is just a fancy 17th century word for stuff we threw in a pot until it stopped being scary. You'd find corn, squash, beans, dried meat, wild onions, herbs, if they were available, and sometimes things like raccoon or possum or whatever small woodland creature was unfortunate enough to make eye contact with a hungry settler. One particularly infamous recipe was squirrel stew, a dish that, depending on your level of hunger, was either rustic comfort food or a psychological breaking point. Squirrels were everywhere in early colonial America, and unlike deer or turkeys, they didn't require a musket, just a rock, a stick, or a child with aim and emotional distance. Squirrel was skinned, cleaned, we hope, and tossed into boiling water with salt, roots, and maybe some cornbread mush, if you had a particularly celebratory Tuesday. Settlers didn't ask what it was, they just prayed it wasn't still moving. And if stew wasn't cutting it, there were always mystery meat sausages. Much like their European ancestors, colonists weren't about to waste any part of the animal. This included hooves, ears, hearts, livers, tongues, and probably several organs modern textbooks don't acknowledge. The result? Sausages stuffed with everything but the bark, seasoned lightly red, not at all, and stuffed into cleaned intestines with more hope than hygiene. And yes, cleaned was a very generous word in a time when soap was more of a suggestion than a habit. These sausages were often smoked or dried for preservation, then boiled again before serving, because nothing says culinary delight like boiled smoked mystery paste. They were packed with protein, often greasy, and possibly responsible for more than one bout of colonial dysentery. Still, when food was scarce and winter was frosty, you didn't ask questions. You just chewed and focused on your faith. Of course, the colonial diet wasn't all small rodents and offal tubes. Colonists relied heavily on Native American agricultural knowledge, specifically the Three Sisters crops: corn, beans, and squash. These weren't just nutritious, they were revolutionary. Indigenous peoples had cultivated them in sophisticated planting systems for centuries, and without this knowledge, the early settlers probably would have perished even faster than they were already trying to. But in true colonial fashion, Europeans took this food and said, how can we make this blander and more confusing? Corn, for example, was ground into mush, or bread, sometimes boiled with molasses or fat, and eaten daily until it became a spiritual experience. Beans were boiled into oblivion. Squash was treated with suspicion unless it could be roasted or hidden under salt pork. One of the more questionable experiments was the creation of vinegar pies, which sounds like a prank, and tastes like one too. When lemons were scarce and sugar was limited, resourceful bakers used vinegar to mimic the tartness of fruit in pie fillings. The result? A flavor best described as lemon if lemon gave up on itself. Add a crust made with pig lard, and you had yourself a dessert designed to confuse your palate and your guests. And let's not forget mock apple pie, a later colonial invention made using crackers, cinnamon, and cream of tartar to simulate apple flavor. Yes, this was real. Yes, people ate it. No, it did not contain a single apple. But that was colonial cooking in a nutshell. If you didn't have it, fake it. If you couldn't fake it, boil it. If that failed, call it pudding and move on. To top it off, food safety standards were non-existent. Meat was often salted until it resembled edible limestone. Milk was drunk raw and warm. Refrigeration was a hole in the ground. And whatever kitchen sanitation was, it probably included wiping your hands on your apron and praying the mold was friendly. And yet, despite all of this, people survived. They grew communities. They baked hardtack that could be used as a roof tile and a snack. They roasted turkeys the size of toddlers and didn't question where the squirrels had gone. Colonial cuisine was rough, weird, and often deeply unsettling, but it laid the greasy, squirrel-scented groundwork for American cooking as we know it. In the pantheon of historical food crimes, few eras went harder or wobblier than the Victorians. If you've ever looked at a dinner table and thought, this could really use more translucent goo, then congratulations, you've tapped into the 19th century culinary psyche. Because for reasons still being investigated by food historians and therapists, the Victorians fell madly in love with gelatin. All of it. Every possible gelatinous variation. Sweet, savory, solid, sloshy. If it could be suspended in a shimmering cube, it probably was. This wasn't just a passing trend. It was a full-blown culinary movement that turned meals into glossy sculptures of anxiety. Meat in jelly, fish in jelly, vegetables in jelly, and sometimes, just to really push the limits of digestible art, jelly in jelly, a layered monstrosity where each wiggling tear dared your fork to take it seriously. It wasn't a proper Victorian meal unless it jiggled in fear of itself. Let's start with the savoury gelatin terrines, which sound fancy until you realise they were essentially cold meatloaf sealed inside edible glue. Imagine slicing into a loaf of minced veal and peas, only to find it encased in a glistening jelly made from boiled animal bones. And that jelly? It wasn't flavoured with herbs or wine. No, it was often just aspic, the sticky, flavour-light broth that formed when you let meat juice cool and congeal. To be fair, aspic had a practical use. It helped preserve food before refrigeration. It kept dishes moist. It allowed chefs to shape food into bizarre Victorian architecture. But mostly, it existed so someone could proudly bring a moulded salmon tower to a dinner party and say, "Behold, I have defeated both gravity and good taste." Then came the vegetables, which were somehow worse. The Victorians believed a cold moulded gelatin dish, filled with carrots, celery, peas, and occasionally rogue asparagus spears was the height of sophistication. The result was like chewing through a salad that had been cryogenically frozen and reanimated for a science fair. Even eggs weren't safe. Entire cookbooks featured recipes for hard-boiled eggs, floating mid-suspension in lemony aspic, staring at you from inside their jellied prisons like orbs of judgment. If your hors d'oeuvres didn't look like a Victorian snow globe, were you even trying? And don't think the desserts were any less disturbing. Sure, fruit jellies were common, but the Victorians couldn't leave well enough alone. They created layered gelatin trifles that stacked preserved fruits, whipped cream, nuts, cake, and various flavors of jelly into towering rainbow monstrosities that jiggled more than they stood. Cutting into one was like performing surgery on a haunted parfait. These desserts came in every flavor imaginable: orange, raspberry, almond, beef, yes, beef, and sherry, with bits, which sounds like a rejected candy from a Dickensian nightmare. Some were even sparkled with edible gold or shaped like birds, crowns, or flowers, because apparently no one had yet said, maybe just a pie? But why? Why did the Victorians turn dinner into a competitive gelatin sport? The answer, as usual, lies in a toxic cocktail of status, science, and Victorian repression. For starters, gelatin was hard to make. You couldn't just buy a box of powder. You had to boil down hooves, bones, or skin for hours, sometimes days, until the broth thickened into usable goo. This made it expensive and time-consuming, which in Victorian England automatically meant elegant. If your household had a dedicated scullery maid just to clarify calf's foot jelly, you were clearly upper crust. Jelly dishes became a way to flex your wealth, your servants, and your weirdly intense desire to sculpt chicken salad into a jelly swan. Secondly, gelatin was sciencey. The Victorians were obsessed with the Industrial Revolution and scientific advancement, and jelly seemed like a miracle of chemistry. It was edible alchemy. It turned liquids into solids, which was basically sorcery with better cutlery. Lastly, and perhaps most tragically, Victorian cuisine was emotionally repressed. Everything had to be proper, clean, molded, and restrained. What better way to display moral virtue than by forcing your food to hold its shape, even while it shivered in silent terror? Of course, not everyone loved it. Satirical publications mocked jelly mania. Diners whispered about aspic disasters that collapsed mid-transport. And somewhere, deep in the pantry of Buckingham Palace, a footman probably wept quietly as he demolded another tuna pineapple gel ring. But make no mistake, for much of the 1800s, jelly ruled the Victorian table like a transparent, wobbly monarch. Cookbooks featured entire sections devoted to gelatin recipes. Socialites one-upped each other with increasingly elaborate jellied centerpieces. There were jelly molds in every shape: bundt rings, towers, castles, and terrifying human faces. Yes, really. Someone out there served gelatin with a nose, and though the jelly craze eventually faded, its sticky fingerprints remain. Every time you see a jello salad at a family potluck, every time you pass that neon green monstrosity with marshmallows floating inside, just know the Victorians did it first, and they did it weirder. The 20th century was a time of dazzling progress. Cars got faster, radios got louder, and man walked on the moon. But for every leap forward in technology, there was an equally baffling stumble in the kitchen. Because for some reason, modernity meant aggressively canning everything, putting meat in lime gelatin, and pretending that frozen Salisbury steak was the height of domestic triumph. Let's begin with the jiggling crown jewel of mid-century confusion, aspic, which, shockingly, made a comeback during the post-war era. You'd think, after the Victorian jelly trauma, humanity might have learned. But no, the 1950s decided to bring back gelatin with a vengeance. Only this time it was brightly coloured, sometimes sweet, sometimes savoury, and almost always visually distressing. And nowhere was this more evident than in lime gelatin, with shredded meat inside it. Yes, meat in lime jello, with a few olives, maybe a celery stick, and a hard-boiled egg lurking in the middle, like a terrible surprise. This was called a salad, by the way, in case you needed further proof that reality was unraveling. Cookbooks from the era are packed with recipes like ring around the tuna and jellied ham loaf, creations that defy logic, physics, and your stomach's will to live. Nothing says modern progress like meat suspended in lime gelatin. But it wasn't just gelatin. Enter the star of ration-friendly meat innovation. Spam. Short for spiced ham, though some swear it stands for something posing as meat. Spam became a household staple during World War II. Canned. Shelf-stable, and alarmingly pink. It was the protein savior of the Allied forces and the dinner-time dread of generations to come. Spam was versatile. Sure, you could fry it, bake it, dice it, or, if you hated yourself, eat it cold straight from the can. It was served with eggs, rice, on toast, and in casseroles that dared to ask, what if meat could also be a square? But while it was a symbol of resilience during wartime, post-war America kept eating it long after peace returned, as if to punish themselves for winning. And Spam wasn't alone. The 20th century ushered in a tsunami of processed foods. Canned macaroni, canned ravioli, canned cheese, and yes, canned whole chicken. This was exactly what it sounds like. An entire, pale, slippery chicken pulled from a tin can like a cursed genie. It quivered. It oozed. It smelled faintly like betrayal, but it was convenient. All you had to do was heat it up and ignore everything your senses were screaming at you. Then came TV dinners. The frozen future, brought to you by science and a crippling fear of family meals. Created in the 1950s by the Swanson Company. TV dinners were the ultimate in modern convenience. You got a tin tray with perfectly portioned sections, one for rubbery turkey, one for congealed gravy, one for mashed potatoes that resembled spackle, and one for a brownie that managed to be burnt and undercooked simultaneously. The brilliance of TV dinners wasn't the food, it was the concept you could eat alone, on the couch, while watching the glowing altar of American culture. No plates, no cleanup, no conversation, just you, your meatloaf puck, and Ed Sullivan. If that isn't the American dream, what is? But nothing encapsulates the bizarre optimism of the era like atomic cuisine. Yes, named after actual atoms, this was the 1950s fantasy of food that felt scientific, futuristic, and mildly radioactive. It was the age of space-age cooking, where housewives were promised that soon we'd be making steak in a ray gun and desserts in centrifuges. Atomic cookbooks featured geometrically arranged meals, pastel food dyes, and an unsettling number of recipes involving gelatin, pimento loaf, and cottage cheese all on the same plate. And don't forget the obsession with pineapple rings. Everything got pineapple, meatloaf, ham, casseroles, deviled eggs. If you didn't have a pineapple ring sitting atop your entree, you were basically living in the Stone Age. Even drinks weren't safe. Punch bowls came spiked with radioactive-looking sherbets. Carbonated pickles were a thing for reasons no one has ever fully explained. And Tang, that orange powder beloved by astronauts and no one else, became a kitchen staple, because what says nutrition like sugar, dye, and a vague citrus vibe? And then came the Jell-O cookbook apocalypse. The 1960s and 70s saw an explosion of recipes that aimed to turn Jell-O into an entire lifestyle. Dinner parties featured layered gelatin towers, molded seafood salads, and things called vegetable medleys that were 90% lime gelatin and 10% pure regret. The gelatin mold became a symbol of domestic achievement, and the louder it jiggled, the prouder the host. But deep beneath the glistening surface of all this modern convenience lurked a quiet horror. These foods were often loaded with preservatives, dyes and mystery ingredients no one could pronounce. Sure, it was easy, but was it good? Not usually. The 20th century taught us that just because science can suspend Vienna sausages in gelatin doesn't mean it should. And yet, despite the processed weirdness, the overuse of canned meats, and the overwhelming presence of congealed side dishes, these meals captured a moment in time, a blend of hope, innovation, and deeply questionable taste. They were part of the post-war optimism, a belief that technology could fix anything, even dinner. If history has taught us anything, it's this. Just because you can eat something, doesn't mean you should. And in our modern era, where attention spans are short, and food is now designed more for views than vitamins, we've somehow managed to out-weird even the Victorians. Yes, we've gone from stuffing dormice and boiling squirrels to eating glitter-covered sushi that tastes like Instagram filters. Welcome to the 21st century, the golden age of food trends that scream, "Look at me," and whisper, "You'll regret this by dessert." Let's begin with rainbow bagels, a food trend that exploded out of Brooklyn like a unicorn-themed fever dream. These neon bread loops, look like they were designed by a committee of toddlers on a sugar bender. Pink, blue, yellow and green, swirled together in a kaleidoscope of what the actual toast, and usually paired with funfetti cream cheese or frosting, that somehow makes the bagel taste like sadness dipped in vanilla extract. Rainbow bagels aren't here to be delicious. They're here to be photographed. One bite, and you'll realize that color does not equal flavor. It just equals confusion, like licking a birthday party decoration. But if you thought that was wild, wait until you try charcoal ice cream. Yes, ice cream made with activated charcoal, which gives it a deep black hue and an unfortunate association with chimney soot. Why would people eat this? Because it looks amazing in pictures. Why shouldn't they? Because activated charcoal can interfere with medications and, more importantly, tastes like frozen campfire ash. Still, it became a wellness trend. People claimed it detoxed your body, because nothing says health like turning your dessert into a spoonful of haunted BBQ. Then we have gold-covered food, the culinary version of someone yelling, "I'm rich," through a mouthful of mediocrity. Burgers coated in edible gold leaf, donuts sprinkled with gold flakes, sushi wrapped in 24-karat arrogance. Gold doesn't taste like anything. It just costs a lot and makes your meal look like a rejected music video prop. And yet, people continue to spend hundreds of dollars to eat something that will, quite literally, end up in the toilet 12 hours later, proving once again that some folks have more money than seasoning. And then there's TikTok food, a universe where logic and taste go to die in the name of viral fame. Some trends are harmless fun, like pancake cereal or whipped coffee, but others are pure culinary crimes, like NyQuil chicken. Yes, that happened. Someone boiled chicken in cough syrup because they could, and the internet, in its infinite chaos, said, "Yeah, let's all try it." Other TikTok trends include mustard on watermelon, which tastes exactly like betrayal, and grape caviar, made from cutting grapes into tiny spheres and pretending it's classy. Spoiler, it isn't. There's also the great cloud bread incident, where millions tried to bake an airy, sugar-packed lump that looked like cotton candy but tasted like disappointment and egg whites. It was soft, blue, fluffy, and universally described as meh, but it got likes. So who needs flavor? Then came the giant food phase. Think burgers the size of car tires, sushi rolls longer than your leg, and milkshakes with entire cupcakes, cookies, and sparklers sticking out. These aren't meant to be eaten. They're meant to be posed with, posted, and left half melted in a corner of shame. And we can't forget the drinks. Glitter lattes, mermaid frappuccinos, and galaxy bubble teas, so layered with color, sparkle, and sugar that they qualify as a paint sample more than a beverage. Order one, and it feels like you're drinking a Lisa Frank folder from 1997. We've gone from stuffing mice to eating glittery sushi that tastes like Instagram filters. What ties all these trends together isn't flavor, it's aesthetic survival. In a world where your meal needs to look fabulous for the 4 seconds it's on camera, taste has taken a backseat to spectacle. We've replaced spice with sparkle, texture with filters, and satisfaction with dopamine pings from strangers tapping like. Of course, not all modern trends are disasters. Some give rise to creativity, cultural fusion, and playful experimentation. But when the line between innovative and edible is crossed by a blue lasagna made from dyed cheese and crushed Doritos, it might be time to stop and ask, do I want to eat this, or do I just want people to watch me eat it? Because while our ancestors may have made questionable culinary choices, stuffing swans with smaller birds, boiling squirrels in despair stew, or molding fish into shimmering jelly towers, they usually did it for survival, status, or religious fasting. Today, we do it for the algorithm, and that might be the weirdest food trend of all.